The Ghost in the Wires, October 1st, 2013, San Francisco, 3:15 in the afternoon. Inside the Glen Park branch of the public library, sunlight falls quietly through tall windows onto rows of bookshelves. Students flip through pages. A librarian stamps a due date. In the back corner, near the science fiction section, a young man sits at a table with his laptop open, headphones in, completely absorbed in his screen. He looks like anyone else. A grad student, maybe. A freelancer killing time on a Tuesday afternoon. He has no idea that at this exact moment, federal agents are watching him from less than 10 feet away. He has no idea that in the next 90 seconds, his entire empire, a hidden marketplace worth over $1.2 billion, is about to collapse in complete silence, without a single gunshot, without a single siren. Because this isn't a drug bust, not in the way you're picturing it. There are no dealers on a street corner, no warehouses stacked with product, no cartel enforcers with guns. This empire exists nowhere and everywhere. It runs on encrypted code, hidden servers scattered across the globe, and a currency that, at the time, most people had never even heard of. This is the story of the Silk Road. Welcome to Case Files and the Economic Crisis of the Century, the series that takes you inside the darkest, most complex criminal empires that shaped our modern world. I'm your host, and today we begin the most fascinating case file yet, the rise and fall of the largest black market drug marketplace in human history, one that was never hidden in an alley or a basement, but buried inside the architecture of the internet itself. Before we descend into this story, I want to ask you for something small. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this series covers cases so layered, so cinematic, that you will not want to miss a single episode. And if you're already part of this community, hit like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like the one you're about to hear. Okay, let's go back into the shadows. Here's what makes this case different from every true crime story you've ever heard. The man behind the Silk Road wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't raised in gang violence or organized crime. He was a bright, articulate young man from Texas who studied physics, read philosophy, and genuinely believed, at least at first, that he was building something good, something revolutionary, a truly free marketplace beyond the reach of governments, taxes, and control. He called it an experiment in economic freedom. The world would come to call it something else entirely. To understand how something like this could exist, a black market processing hundreds of thousands of transactions, moving drugs from over 100 countries, generating over $1 billion, completely invisible to law enforcement for years. We have to understand three things most people barely think about. First, a technology built by the United States Navy, ironically, to protect intelligence communications that would later become the cloak of invisibility for the internet's underworld. Second, a mysterious digital currency born out of the ashes of the 2008 financial collapse, designed by someone whose real identity remains unknown to this day. And third, a young idealist who took those two tools, combined them, and built something no one, not the FBI, not the DEA, not Interpol, saw coming. Over the next 12 chapters, we're going to pull back every layer of this story like peeling an onion, appropriately enough, since the very technology that made this marketplace possible is called onion routing. We'll trace the philosophical roots of a young man's obsession with liberty and how that obsession slowly warped into something far darker. We'll break down in plain language exactly how Bitcoin and the Tor network work, no tech degree required. We'll go inside the marketplace itself, the seller ratings, the customer service, the strange sense of professionalism inside a criminal enterprise. We'll follow federal agents down a years-long trail of digital breadcrumbs, tiny mistakes, forgotten forum posts, and one server misconfiguration that would unravel it all. We'll examine disturbing contested allegations of murder for hire that reveal just how far power can corrupt even the purest ideology. And we'll relive, second by second, the exact moment this empire fell apart in a public library over a laptop that was never supposed to be caught open. But this story doesn't end with an arrest, because after the fall of the Silk Road, something strange happened. Copycats emerged. Bigger, smarter, more resilient marketplaces rose from its ashes, and the seized Bitcoin, worth a few $1 million at the time of confiscation, would later balloon into billions, turning the United States government, almost accidentally, into one of the largest holders of Bitcoin on Earth. There's a bitter irony buried in all of this that we'll spend real time unpacking. A criminal marketplace may have inadvertently helped legitimize the very currency it was built to exploit. And underneath all of it, there's a question that's going to follow us through every chapter of this series, one that has no easy answer. When a brilliant mind builds a perfect invisible system, what stops it from being used for evil? Before we step into chapter 1, the freedom dream of a Texas boy, I want to say this one more time. If you're finding value in this story, subscribing and liking genuinely makes a difference for this channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps us keep producing deep cinematic case files like this one. So go ahead, tap that button now, and then let's continue. This is a story about idealism curdling into empire, about a technology meant to protect whistleblowers being used to move heroin across borders, about a boy who wanted freedom and built a prison for himself instead. I mean, this is the Silk Road, and it begins, like most great tragedies, with a dream. Chapter 1, the freedom dream of a Texas boy to understand how a young man could build the largest black market the internet has ever seen. We can't start with the crime. We have to start with the boy. Because long before there was a Silk Road, before there was a Dread Pirate Roberts, before there was a laptop seized in a public library, there was simply a curious, restless kid growing up in Austin, Texas, trying to make sense of a world that felt, to him, fundamentally unfair. Ross William Ulbricht was born in 1984 into a comfortable middle-class household. His father worked as a mechanical engineer. His mother ran a small business. By every outward measure, this was not the childhood of a future criminal mastermind. There was no poverty here, no broken home, no early brush with violence or gangs. If you had met young Ross at age 10, you would have seen a bright-eyed boy who devoured books, who asked too many questions at the dinner table, who took apart radios just to understand how they worked. Teachers described him as gifted, not just intelligent in the conventional sense, but philosophically curious. The kind of child who didn't just want to know what was true, but why it was true, and whether it had to be that way at all. He excelled in science and mathematics, and by the time he reached high school, physics had become something close to an obsession. He loved the elegance of it, the idea that beneath the chaos of the physical world, there were clean, discoverable laws that governed everything: cause and effect, input and output, a kind of hidden order waiting to be uncovered by anyone patient enough to look for it. This way of thinking, this hunger for hidden systems and elegant rules, would follow him for the rest of his life. It would eventually lead him toward economics. And economics, more than physics, would become the intellectual seed from which everything else grew. Ross went on to study physics at the University of Texas at Dallas, and later pursued a master's degree in material science and engineering at Pennsylvania State University. On paper, he was exactly the kind of young man destined for a stable, respectable career: a research lab, a corporate engineering job, perhaps eventually a doctorate. The traditional American success story was laid out in front of him like a well-paved road. But somewhere along the way, Ross began reading outside his field, and what he read would change the entire trajectory of his life. He discovered a school of economic thought that most Americans have never even heard of: Austrian economics. The name refers not to a nationality, but to a tradition of thinkers, many of Austrian origin, who built an entire philosophy around one central idea: that free markets, left completely alone, without government interference, without central planning, without regulation, are the most efficient, most moral way to organize human society. At the heart of this tradition stood a name that would come to dominate Ross's thinking: Ludwig von Mises. Mises was an economist and philosopher who argued with almost religious conviction that voluntary exchange between individuals was the purest expression of human freedom. No bureaucrat, no government agency, no central bank could ever understand the needs and desires of millions of individuals better than the individuals themselves. Every transaction in this worldview was a small act of liberty. Every government intervention, no matter how well intentioned, was a kind of violence against that liberty. For a mind like Ross's, already trained to see the world in terms of clean systems and elegant rules, this philosophy landed like a thunderbolt. Here was a framework that explained not just how markets worked, but why they were morally justified. Here was a lens through which taxation could be reframed as theft, regulation could be reframed as coercion. The entire apparatus of government could be reframed as an unnecessary, even immoral interference in what should be a purely voluntary system of human cooperation. This is where the seed of libertarianism took root in him, not as a passing political opinion, but as something closer to a personal ethic, a way of understanding right and wrong. Ross began to see himself quietly as someone who believed in a radically different kind of world. Um, a world where adults could make their own choices, buy and sell whatever they wanted, and without a government standing over their shoulder deciding what was permitted and what was forbidden. It's worth pausing here because this is the psychological hinge on which the entire story turns. Ross Ulbricht did not begin as someone who wanted to build a criminal empire. He began as an idealist, someone who believed sincerely that he had identified a flaw in how society was organized and that this flaw was causing real harm to real people. The war on drugs, in his eyes, was a prime example. He watched as young people, often from poor or marginalized communities, were incarcerated for years over the sale or possession of substances that, in his view, adults should have the right to choose for themselves. He saw violence tied not to the drugs themselves, but to their illegality. The gang wars, the cartel violence, the black market chaos that emerges specifically because a product is banned rather than regulated. To Ross, this wasn't just bad policy, it was a moral catastrophe. And like many bright young idealists before him, he began to wonder whether there might be a way to fix it. Not through politics, which he distrusted as inherently corrupt and slow, but through something else, something more elegant, something closer to his instincts as an engineer. But before that idea would fully form, Ross's life took a more ordinary, more frustrating turn. After finishing his graduate studies, he returned to Austin and tried, like so many young graduates, to build a career and a future. He took on various jobs and business ventures. He co-founded a small company that sold used books online, an early attempt at entrepreneurship that never quite took off the way he had hoped. He dabbled in other small business ideas as well, searching for something that would let him combine his intellectual ideals with practical success. None of it worked out. Friends and acquaintances from this period describe a young man who was intelligent and hardworking, but increasingly restless, increasingly frustrated. He seemed to be searching for something bigger than a modest online bookstore, something that matched the scale of the ideas swirling in his head. He wasn't short on ambition, he was short on an outlet for it. This is a critical detail because it's easy, with hindsight, to imagine Ross as someone who was always destined for the dark path he eventually took. But the reality is messier and in some ways more unsettling. He was, for a period of time, simply a young man in his mid-20s, watching his entrepreneurial efforts fail one after another, feeling the gap widen between the brilliant revolutionary future he imagined for himself and the underwhelming reality of his day-to-day life. It's often in that gap, between grand ambition and disappointing reality, that dangerous ideas find their opening. Around this time, Ross began keeping a journal. Not a diary of daily events in the traditional sense, but something closer to a philosophical notebook, a place where he processed his frustrations, his ambitions, and his evolving worldview. And it's in these journal entries that we get our clearest window into the moment his ideology began to curdle into something operational, something actionable. He wrote about wanting to have a significant, lasting impact on the world. He wrote about wanting to create something that would embody his economic ideals, not just talk about them in the abstract. He wanted, in his own words, to build a real-world experiment in economic freedom, something tangible that would prove his theories correct, not in a classroom or an essay, but in the messy, complicated real world. And then came the idea. What if there was a marketplace, entirely online, entirely anonymous, where adults could buy and sell anything they wanted free from government interference? What if the state, which Ross saw as the primary source of violence and inefficiency in the drug trade, could simply be removed from the equation altogether? No police, no prosecutors, no prohibition, just buyers and sellers, connecting directly, rating each other honestly, building a self-regulating community based on reputation rather than law. In Ross's mind, this wasn't a criminal enterprise. It was a kind of libertarian utopia in miniature, a place where his economic philosophy could finally be tested, not through theory, but through practice. He imagined it almost as a scientific experiment: introduce a truly free market, remove the state's coercive hand, and observe what happens. Would people behave honestly, out of self-interest and reputation, the way Austrian economics predicted? Would the market regulate itself more efficiently and more humanely than any government ever could? It's important to sit with this for a moment because it reveals something profound and unsettling about how good intentions can slide into catastrophic outcomes. Ross wasn't imagining a marketplace for hardened criminals. He was imagining a marketplace for people like himself, college-educated, thoughtful, ideologically driven individuals who simply believe that adults should have the right to make their own choices about what they put into their own bodies. But ideas, once set into motion, rarely stay contained within the boundaries of their original intention. Because the moment you build a marketplace with no rules beyond mutual consent, no government oversight, and complete anonymity, you don't just attract idealistic libertarians looking to prove a philosophical point. You attract everyone. You attract addiction. You attract exploitation. You attract organized crime looking for a new, safer distribution channel. You attract violence that Ross believed, perhaps naively, his system would eliminate rather than simply hide from view. This is the fragile, blurry line where the story begins to shift from idealism to something far darker. And Ross, at this early stage, either didn't see that line or convinced himself it didn't apply to him. What makes this chapter of the story so unsettling isn't that Ross was a monster from the beginning. It's that he wasn't. He was, by most accounts, thoughtful, articulate, even gentle in his personal relationships. He cared, or at least believed he cared, about reducing harm in the world. And yet, that very belief, twisted through the lens of absolute ideological certainty, became the justification for building a platform that would ultimately be linked to addiction, overdose deaths, and, according to later allegations, extreme violence. This is one of the darkest patterns explored throughout this series. The criminals who cause the most damage are rarely cartoonish villains, twirling mustaches in the shadows. They are disturbingly often intelligent, principled people who become so convinced of their own righteousness that they stop questioning the human cost of their actions. By the time Ross reached his late 20s, the idea had crystallized into something more concrete. He wasn't content to simply theorize about a free market experiment anymore. He wanted to build it. But building it meant taking on an identity separate from Ross Ulbricht, the failed entrepreneur from Austin. It meant stepping into a role, almost a character, someone who could operate in complete anonymity, someone whose name would never be tied back to his own. He chose a name steeped in symbolism, borrowed from popular culture: Dread Pirate Roberts. For those unfamiliar with the reference, it comes from a story in which the title is not a single person, but a legendary identity passed down from one masked pirate to the next, each one taking on the name to preserve the myth and the fear associated with it, regardless of who was actually behind the mask. It's a remarkably telling choice. Even at the very outset, Ross seemed to understand, on some level, that what he was building was bigger than himself and needed to be protected by a persona that could outlive, or at least outmaneuver, his own identity. Dread Pirate Roberts would become untouchable, mythic, almost folkloric within the corners of the internet, where this marketplace would eventually thrive. And behind that legend, for a time, no one would know there was simply a 26-year-old physics graduate from Texas. But an idea, however carefully wrapped in philosophy and however boldly renamed, cannot become reality on its own. Ross had a vision. He had a justification. He had, in Dread Pirate Roberts, a mask to hide behind. What he did not yet have was the technology. Because building an anonymous, government-proof marketplace requires more than ambition and ideology. It requires a way to hide your location, your identity, and your communications from every law enforcement agency on Earth. It requires a currency that no bank, no government, and no financial institution can trace, freeze, or seize. In the early months of what would become the Silk Road, Ross began digging deeper into the darker, more technical corners of the internet, searching for the tools that could turn his philosophical experiment into an operational reality. What he found there, tucked away in obscure forums and cryptography mailing lists, were two extraordinary pieces of technology, each with its own strange and fascinating origin story. One was a network built, ironically, by the United States military, designed to protect anonymous communication. The other was a currency, barely a couple of years old at that point, created by a mysterious figure whose true identity remains unknown to this day. Together, these two technologies would give Ross Ulbricht everything he needed to build his experiment in absolute economic freedom. And in doing so, they would also give him everything he needed to build one of the most consequential criminal empires in the history of the internet. Chapter 2. Tor, the invisible cloak of the internet. Every great deception needs a disguise, and the disguise that made the Silk Road possible wasn't invented by a criminal, a hacker, or a cartel. It was invented by the United States government. This is one of the strangest, most quietly ironic threads running through this entire story. The very technology that allowed Ross Ulbricht to build an untraceable criminal marketplace was originally designed, funded, and built by the American military, specifically to protect the secrets of its own intelligence operative. To understand how something so paradoxical could happen, we need to travel back before Silk Road even existed as an idea. We need to go back to the 1990s into a research laboratory belonging to the United States Naval Research Laboratory, where a small team of mathematicians and computer scientists were wrestling with a very specific, very sensitive problem. The problem was this: how do you allow someone to send information over the internet without anyone being able to trace where that information came from or where it was going? This might sound like a strange thing for the government to want. After all, isn't the government usually the one trying to trace people, not protect them from being traced? But the reasoning becomes clear when you consider who the researchers were actually trying to protect. Imagine an intelligence officer stationed overseas needing to send sensitive information back to headquarters without a hostile government intercepting the transmission and identifying the source. Imagine a diplomat in an authoritarian country trying to communicate securely with colleagues abroad. In these scenarios, anonymity isn't a tool for wrongdoing. It's a matter of life and death. If the wrong government intercepts a communication and traces it back to its origin, the consequences could mean imprisonment, torture, or execution for the person on the other end. So naval researchers began developing a system that could protect the identity of anyone transmitting data online, regardless of who was trying to trace them. They called their creation, quite poetically, onion routing. The name comes from the way the system layers encryption, one layer wrapped around another, much like the layers of an onion. And it is this mechanism, more than anything else, that would later make the Silk Road practically invisible to law enforcement for years. Let's slow down here, because understanding exactly how onion routing works is essential to understanding why Ross Ulbricht believed with such confidence that he could build an untouchable marketplace. On a normal internet connection, when you send information from your computer to a website, that data travels in a fairly direct path. Your internet service provider can see where the data is going. The website you're visiting can see where the data came from, usually identified by something called an Internet Protocol address, a kind of digital return address tied to your specific device and location. This is normally how investigators track people down online. They follow the digital return address back to its source. Onion routing was designed specifically to destroy that traceable path. Here's how it works, in the simplest terms possible. Instead of sending your data directly to its destination, the system routes it through a series of randomly selected computers spread out across different countries, all volunteered by users around the world. These computers are often called nodes or relays. Guess before your data even leaves your computer, it gets wrapped in multiple layers of encryption, like a nesting doll, one layer for each relay it will pass through. The first relay, the one closest to you, can only peel back the outermost layer of encryption. Once it does, it learns only one thing: which relay to send the data to next. It has no idea what the data actually says, and no idea where the data will ultimately end up. That second relay then peels back another layer, learning only where to send the data next, still with no knowledge of the original source or the final destination. And this process repeats itself, layer after layer, relay after relay, typically passing through 3 or more separate computers scattered across the globe before the data finally reaches its destination in fully decrypted form. The beauty, or depending on your perspective, the horror of this system lies in its structure. No single relay in the chain ever knows both where the data came from and where it's ultimately going. The first relay knows your location, but not your destination. The last relay knows the destination, but has no idea it originated from you. It's a chain of ignorance, deliberately engineered so that no single point in the system can betray the full picture. Imagine trying to trace a letter that passed through 100 different anonymous couriers, each one only knowing the identity of the courier directly before and after them in the chain, with no courier ever seeing the full route from sender to recipient. That is essentially what onion routing accomplishes, except it happens in milliseconds, continuously, across thousands of volunteer-run relays spread across nearly every country on Earth. By the early 2000s, the Naval Research Laboratories project had evolved and eventually spun off into an independent, nonprofit project that would become known publicly as Tor, an acronym for the Onion Router. And this is where the story takes its first major ideological turn. Rather than keeping this technology locked away for exclusive government or military use, the project was released publicly and its source code made openly available for anyone in the world to study, use, and improve. The reasoning behind this decision was, in its own way, quite brilliant. If only government agents used an anonymity tool, then simply detecting that someone was using the tool would immediately flag them as a spy or an intelligence operative. But if millions of ordinary people around the world also used the same tool for completely different reasons, then anonymity itself became camouflage. A spy using Tor could blend into a much larger crowd of journalists, activists, privacy advocates, and ordinary citizens, all using the same technology for their own personal reasons. And so Tor became something remarkable, a tool for genuine, powerful good in the world. Human rights activists in authoritarian countries began using Tor to communicate safely with the outside world, without fear of government surveillance leading to their arrest. Journalists used it to protect confidential sources, particularly in nations where speaking to the press could result in violent retaliation. Whistleblowers used it to leak information about corruption and abuse without exposing their identities. Ordinary citizens living under oppressive regimes used it simply to access information their governments had tried to censor or block entirely. This is the paradox we have to sit with for a moment, because it sits at the very heart of this entire case. And the same layers of encryption that allowed a dissident in an authoritarian country to safely expose human rights abuses were the exact same layers of encryption that would soon allow a marketplace for illegal drugs to operate completely beyond the reach of law enforcement. Anonymity, it turns out, has no built-in moral compass. It protects the vulnerable and the villainous with exactly the same efficiency. The technology cannot distinguish between a journalist trying to expose a war crime and a criminal trying to hide a drug shipment. It simply does its job. It hides identity completely and effectively for anyone who chooses to use it. And somewhere out there, browsing through technical forums and cryptography discussions, absorbing every detail he could find about how this system worked, was Ross Ulbricht. We can only imagine what that moment must have felt like for him. The moment when the pieces of his idea suddenly clicked into place. He had already developed the philosophical framework, a truly free market, free from government interference, based purely on the voluntary exchange between consenting adults. What he had been missing was the mechanism, the actual technical infrastructure that could make such a marketplace possible without immediately being shut down and its founder immediately identified and arrested. Tor solved that problem completely. If a marketplace was hosted not on the regular visible internet, but instead on what would come to be known as the dark web, a hidden layer of the internet only accessible through Tor, then the location of its servers could remain permanently unknown. Law enforcement wouldn't be able to simply trace an internet protocol address back to a physical building the way they normally would with a website. The layers of onion routing would scramble that trail into meaninglessness. For Ross, this must have felt like discovering the final missing piece of an elaborate puzzle. Here, finally, was the door. The door to a marketplace that could not be shut down by conventional means. The door to a system where buyers and sellers could interact completely anonymously, hidden behind layer after layer of encrypted, untraceable routing. It's worth pausing to note something important here about how ideas like this actually take root in a person's mind. Ross wasn't simply discovering a tool and thinking this could be useful for crime. He was discovering a tool and thinking this finally makes my philosophy achievable. In his mind, the technology wasn't enabling wrongdoing. It was enabling freedom. It was removing the government's ability to interfere in what he believed should be private, voluntary transactions between consenting adults. The criminal potential of the tool was, to him, almost a secondary consideration, overshadowed entirely by its ideological promise. This is an important psychological thread to hold on to as this story unfolds, because it explains so much about the confidence, even the audacity, with which Ross moved forward. He wasn't approaching this project the way a typical criminal approaches an illegal scheme filled with anxiety and paranoia about getting caught. He approached it the way an engineer approaches a fascinating technical challenge, filled with excitement about the elegance of the solution he had found. And so, sometime around late 2010, in a modest rented room, Ross began to build. He had no formal background in web development or advanced programming at this point. What he had was determination, an engineer's patience, key tech, and access to an overwhelming amount of freely available documentation and open source code. He began teaching himself the programming skills necessary to build a functioning online marketplace, one capable of running as what is known as a hidden service on the Tor network, meaning it could only be accessed by users who were themselves connected through Tor, using a special address ending not in the familiar .com, but in the more obscure .onion. Friends and associates from this period, those who had any inkling of what he was working on, later described a young man almost completely consumed by his project. Ross spent long stretches of time alone, hunched over his laptop, teaching himself coding languages through online tutorials and forums, debugging errors late into the night slowly, painstakingly, transforming an abstract philosophical vision into functioning lines of code. There is something almost mythic, in a dark and unsettling way, about picturing this scene. A single young man in an unremarkable rented room with nothing but a laptop and an internet connection, quietly assembling the foundation of what would soon become one of the largest, most consequential black markets in the history of human commerce. No office, no team of engineers, no corporate headquarters. Just Ross, alone, night after night, line by line. He built a basic marketplace structure, a way for sellers to create listings, a way for buyers to browse those listings anonymously, a rudimentary messaging system so that buyers and sellers could communicate without revealing any identifying information about themselves. Every design decision was made with one overriding priority: preserve anonymity at all costs for every single participant on the platform. But as Ross worked through the technical architecture of his marketplace, he ran headfirst into a problem that Tor alone could not solve. Anonymity could hide where people were located. Anonymity could hide who people actually were, but it could not hide money. If buyers paid for drugs using a normal credit card or a bank transfer or even something like PayPal, every single transaction would leave behind a clear financial trail, one that could be traced directly back to a real name, a real bank account, a real physical address. All of the sophisticated anonymity provided by onion routing would become completely worthless the moment actual money changed hands through a traditional financial system. Ross needed something else entirely. He needed a currency that existed outside the traditional banking system altogether. A currency with no central bank, no government oversight, and ideally, No way for any single authority to trace a transaction back to a real-world identity. At the time, such a currency barely existed in any meaningful, widely usable form. But a small, obscure community of cryptographers, programmers, and libertarian-minded technologists had already begun experimenting with exactly this idea, inspired by a mysterious white paper published under a pseudonym just a couple of years earlier. Ross began digging into this world as well, and what he found there would complete the final piece of his vision, giving him not just a hidden marketplace, but a hidden currency to match it. The invisible cloak had been found. Now he needed invisible money to go inside it. Chapter 3, Bitcoin, the currency of darkness and light, to understand the second half of the puzzle. Ross Ulbricht was assembling, we need to leave Texas behind for a moment and travel to a much larger stage, the global financial system in the middle of collapse. In in 2008, the world watched in real time as one of the largest financial catastrophes in modern history unfolded. Massive banks, institutions that had seemed permanent, untouchable, too big to ever fail, began crumbling one after another. Millions of people lost their homes, millions more lost their jobs, their savings, their sense of security in a system they had trusted their entire lives. And as the dust settled, a bitter, widespread question began circulating among ordinary citizens, economists, and disillusioned technologists alike. How had a small number of powerful financial institutions been allowed to gamble so recklessly with the wealth of the entire world and walk away largely unpunished, often bailed out with taxpayer money, while ordinary families paid the price? It was in this exact atmosphere of anger, distrust, and disillusionment with centralized financial power that something strange and quiet happened. In October of 2008, a short technical document appeared online, posted to an obscure cryptography mailing list. It was authored by someone, or perhaps some group, using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. To this day, more than a decade and a half later, the true identity behind that name remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern technology. The document was titled, quite plainly, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, and buried within its dense, technical language was an idea that would eventually reshape global finance, empower revolutionary new industries, and almost accidentally provide the final missing piece Ross Ulbricht needed to build his hidden marketplace. The timing of Bitcoin's arrival was not a coincidence, and Satoshi Nakamoto made that clear in a subtle but pointed way. Embedded permanently within the very first block of the Bitcoin blockchain, a piece of data now referred to as the Genesis block, Nakamoto included a short text reference to a newspaper headline from that same period, one describing a British government minister on the brink of a second bank bailout. It was, in effect, a permanent, unchangeable message stamped into the foundation of this new currency, a quiet act of protest against the very financial system that had just brought the world to its knees. Bitcoin was designed to solve, at least in theory, exactly the kind of failure the 2008 crisis had exposed. What if money didn't need to depend on trust in banks or governments at all? What if a currency could exist that no single central authority controlled, that couldn't be printed endlessly by a government trying to paper over its financial mistakes, that couldn't be frozen, seized, or manipulated by any single institution? To understand how Bitcoin actually attempted to achieve this, we need to understand a concept that, at the time, was almost entirely unknown outside small circles of cryptographers and computer scientists: the blockchain. Let's break this down in the simplest way possible without any technical jargon. Imagine a giant shared notebook. This notebook keeps track of every single transaction that has ever occurred using Bitcoin, from the very first one all the way to the most recent. Now imagine that instead of this notebook being kept in one single place, controlled by one single bank or government, it is copied in its entirety across thousands of separate computers all around the world, all at the same time. Every time a new transaction occurs, that transaction gets bundled together with a batch of other recent transactions into what's called a block. This block then gets added to the very end of the notebook, permanently chained onto all the previous blocks that came before it, which is where the term blockchain actually comes from. A chronological chain of transaction blocks. Here is the crucial part. Before a new block can be added to this shared notebook, thousands of separate computers around the world, none of whom need to know or trust each other, independently verify that the transactions inside that block are legitimate. They check that the sender actually has the funds they're claiming to send and that the transaction hasn't already been recorded somewhere else in the notebook. Once enough of these independent computers agree that everything checks out, the block becomes a permanent, unchangeable part of the historical record, copied identically across every single computer participating in the network. This is what people mean when they describe Bitcoin as decentralized. There is no single bank sitting in the middle of every transaction, approving or denying it. There is no central authority that can simply reach into the system and reverse a transaction, freeze an account, or print more currency out of thin air. The entire system runs on collective agreement, distributed across thousands of independent participants, with mathematics and cryptography rather than trust in an institution, serving as the ultimate guarantee that the system remains honest. For the small community of programmers and cryptographers who first began experimenting with this strange new currency, the appeal was, in many cases, deeply philosophical, not just technical. Many of them shared a similar worldview to Ross Ulbricht, a distrust of centralized power, a belief that individuals should be able to transact freely without government oversight, and a conviction that traditional financial systems had failed the very people they were supposed to serve. Now, let's return to Ross, sometime around late 2010, deep into the technical construction of his hidden marketplace, and facing the exact problem we left off with in the previous chapter. How do you allow buyers and sellers to exchange money for goods without leaving behind a traceable financial trail? When Ross first encountered Bitcoin, by his own later writings, it must have felt like watching the final piece of an elaborate puzzle drop perfectly into place. Think about what Bitcoin actually offered from the specific perspective of someone trying to build an anonymous marketplace. Transactions could be sent directly from one person to another, with no bank, no PayPal, no credit card company sitting in the middle monitoring the exchange. While every transaction was, in fact, permanently recorded on that public shared notebook we described earlier, the identities behind each transaction weren't directly tied to real names or physical addresses, at least not in any obvious, immediately visible way. Instead, transactions were linked to strings of letters and numbers, known as wallet addresses, which, on the surface, revealed nothing about who actually controlled them. Combine this with the anonymity already provided by the Tor network, and Ross now had, in theory, a complete system. Tor would hide the physical location and identity of everyone browsing and communicating on the marketplace. Bitcoin would hide the financial trail of every transaction taking place within it. Together, these two technologies formed something that had never quite existed before at this scale: a fully anonymous, fully functioning marketplace, operating completely outside the reach of traditional law enforcement and financial regulation. But there's a detail here that's absolutely critical to understanding this moment in history, one that reveals just how early, and in some ways how genuinely risky, Ross's decision actually was. At this point in time, in late 2010 and early 2011, Bitcoin was almost worthless and almost universally unknown. A single Bitcoin, which would later at its peak be worth tens of thousands of dollars, was trading for mere cents, sometimes barely more than a fraction of a single dollar. The vast majority of people on the planet, including most people working in finance and technology, had never even heard the word Bitcoin before. Among those who had heard of it, many dismissed it outright as a strange experiment for computer hobbyists destined to fade into obscurity like countless other niche internet curiosities. This is where we have to acknowledge something uncomfortable about this story. Ross Ulbricht wasn't simply a criminal who stumbled onto an existing tool. In a very real, very consequential sense, he was one of the earliest adopters of a technology that would go on to transform global finance. He saw potential in Bitcoin at a moment when almost no one else did. It's precisely because his motivations were aligned so closely with the philosophical reasons Bitcoin had been created in the first place: distrust of centralized financial power and a belief in the right of individuals to transact freely. The tragedy and the moral complexity of this story lies in what he chose to build with that early insight. By early 2011, Ross had made his decision. Bitcoin would become the exclusive currency of his marketplace. Every transaction, every purchase, every payment to a seller would flow through Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone. There would be no credit cards, no bank transfers, no PayPal, nothing that could leave behind the kind of traceable financial fingerprint that had doomed countless other black market operations in the past. What happened next created one of the strangest, most symbiotic relationships in the early history of cryptocurrency, a relationship that historians and economists still discuss and debate to this day. When the Silk Road launched and slowly began attracting attention, particularly after a widely read article thrust it into public awareness in the middle of 2011, something unexpected happened. Thousands of new users, curious about this hidden marketplace, needed to acquire Bitcoin for the very first time in order to make purchases. This created a sudden, meaningful surge in demand for a currency that, until that point, had existed almost entirely within a small niche community of cryptography enthusiasts. In other words, the Silk Road didn't just use Bitcoin. In its own dark, unintended way, it helped introduce Bitcoin to the wider world. Countless people who had never previously heard the term cryptocurrency were suddenly forced to learn how digital wallets worked, how to acquire Bitcoin through early, often clunky exchanges, and how to send it securely, all because they wanted to access this hidden marketplace. And the relationship worked in the opposite direction as well. As more people acquired Bitcoin specifically to use on the Silk Road, the overall demand for Bitcoin increased, which, according to basic economic principles Ross himself deeply believed in, helped drive its price gradually upward over time. A currency that had been trading for fractions of a cent began slowly, steadily gaining real, measurable value. This created an almost paradoxical, mutually reinforcing cycle. The Silk Road needed Bitcoin's anonymity and decentralization in order to function and survive. And Bitcoin, in its fragile, uncertain infancy, needed exactly the kind of real-world use case and growing user base that the Silk Road was inadvertently providing. Two experimental, revolutionary technologies, one born from a desire to protect government secrets, the other born from a reaction against the failures of centralized banking, had found each other, and together they were about to power one of the most consequential criminal marketplaces in internet history. It's worth pausing here to sit with the full weight of this irony, because it's a thread that will echo throughout the rest of this series. Today, Bitcoin is discussed in boardrooms, embraced by major financial institutions, and held as an asset by governments and corporations around the world. But in its earliest, most fragile years, one of the forces that helped push it from obscurity toward mainstream awareness was a hidden drug marketplace built by a young idealist who believed he was creating an experiment in economic freedom. By early 2011, Ross had assembled every essential piece of his vision. He had the philosophical foundation rooted in Austrian economics and a deep distrust of government intervention. He had the technical infrastructure on the anonymous encrypted architecture of the Tor network. And now he had the financial infrastructure, an anonymous, decentralized currency capable of moving value across the platform without leaving behind the kind of traceable trail that had doomed so many previous black market operations. Every tool was now in place. The philosophy had been formed, the technology had been mastered, the currency had been chosen. There was nothing left standing between Ross Ulbricht and the launch of his marketplace, except one final step, actually opening the doors and finding out whether anyone in the world was ready to walk through them. Chapter 4. Launched in darkness, the Silk Road opens its doors. There was no press conference, no announcement, no fanfare of any kind. The largest black market the internet had ever seen didn't launch with an explosion. It launched with something closer to a whisper. In January of 2011, a short message quietly appeared on a handful of niche online forums frequented by libertarians, cryptography enthusiasts, and early adopters of Bitcoin. The message described a new website, accessible only through the Tor network, calling itself the Silk Road. It invited curious readers to visit, promising a marketplace unlike anything that had existed before, a place where adults could buy and sell goods anonymously, free from government interference, using this strange new currency called Bitcoin. For the handful of people who actually clicked through and explored the site in those very first days, what they found was a modest, almost unremarkable looking marketplace. Simple product listings arranged in familiar looking categories, a basic user account system, a rudimentary but functional way to browse, message sellers, and complete purchases. It looked, in many ways, like a stripped down underground cousin of eBay or Amazon, except every item quietly listed for sale was, in most cases, entirely illegal. The very first recorded transaction on the Silk Road, according to later accounts and court testimony, involved something almost quaint compared to what the marketplace would eventually become: a small bag of psilocybin mushrooms, the psychoactive fungi more commonly associated with recreational and spiritual use than with organized criminal enterprise. It was a modest, almost symbolic beginning. No heroin, no fentanyl, no weapons. Just a small bag of mushrooms, purchased by a stranger, from a stranger, using a currency that barely had any value at the time, moving through a network specifically engineered so that neither party would ever know the other's real identity or location. For weeks, the Silk Road existed almost entirely below the radar of public awareness. Its user base grew slowly, organically, largely through word of mouth within tight-knit online communities already familiar with Tor and Bitcoin. These early users tended to fit a fairly specific profile: technically sophisticated, often libertarian leaning, drawn as much to the philosophical audacity of the project as to the practical convenience of buying drugs without ever having to meet a dealer in person. In many ways, this early period represented something close to Ross's original vision in its purest form: a small, self-selecting community of people who understood the technology, respected the informal rules of the platform, and genuinely seemed to embody the kind of self-regulating, voluntary marketplace that Austrian economic theory had promised was possible. Sellers built reputations through repeated positive transactions. Buyers left feedback. The community, small as it was, appeared to be functioning almost exactly as Ross had envisioned when he first began sketching out the idea in his personal journal. But obscurity, as it turns out, is a fragile kind of protection, and it was about to disappear entirely. In June of 2011, a journalist working for the popular gossip and news website Gawker published an article that would change the trajectory of the Silk Road forever. The piece described in vivid, almost sensational detail the existence of this hidden online marketplace where users could apparently purchase nearly any illegal drug imaginable, delivered directly to their doorstep, all while remaining completely anonymous. The article spread like wildfire. Within days, what had been a niche insider secret shared among a small community of tech-savvy libertarians exploded into a subject of intense mainstream fascination. News outlets around the world picked up the story. Bloggers dissected it. Curious internet users who had never previously heard the words Tor or Bitcoin suddenly found themselves Googling both terms, that trying to understand how something like this could possibly exist, hidden in plain sight, completely beyond the reach of law enforcement. Traffic to the Silk Road surged almost overnight. New users, drawn less by ideological commitment to libertarian economics and more by simple curiosity or by the straightforward convenience of anonymous drug purchasing, began flooding onto the platform in numbers Ross likely never anticipated during those quiet early months. This sudden explosion of public attention triggered an almost immediate response from the highest levels of American government. Within days of the Gawker article's publication, prominent political figures began publicly demanding action. Among the loudest voices was United States Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, who held a press conference explicitly calling on federal law enforcement agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Department of Justice, to shut the Silk Road down immediately. Senator Schumer described the site, quite bluntly, as the most brazen attempt to peddle drugs online that he had ever seen, and demanded swift, decisive federal intervention. His statements were widely covered by national media outlets, effectively guaranteeing that the story would remain in the public spotlight for days, if not weeks, to come. Here is where the story reveals one of its darkest, most counterintuitive twists. a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the entire saga of the Silk Road. The very attempt to shame the marketplace into non existence, the political outrage, the media coverage, the public condemnation, ended up functioning as an extraordinarily effective form of free advertising. Think about what actually happened from the perspective of an ordinary internet user who had never previously heard of the Silk Road. Before the Gawker article and the ensuing political firestorm, this marketplace was a well guarded secret known only to a small, self selecting community. After the controversy erupted, suddenly an enormous portion of the internet using public knew, for the very first time, that a fully functioning, anonymous online drug marketplace existed. And, more importantly, they now knew exactly what it was called, and, in broad terms, how to access it. How to access it. Rather than crushing the Silk Road under the weight of public condemnation, the outrage inadvertently functioned as a massive marketing campaign. Curiosity, it turns out, is a remarkably powerful force, particularly when something is framed by authority figures as dangerous, forbidden, and worthy of urgent government intervention. Thousands of new users, many of whom might never have discovered the platform organically, suddenly went searching for it specifically because a United States senator had publicly declared it a serious threat. This presented Ross Ulbricht, operating quietly under his pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts, with an extraordinarily difficult decision, one that would define the entire trajectory of the rest of his life. On one hand, the sudden surge of political and media attention represented a genuine existential threat. Federal law enforcement agencies, now under direct public pressure from a sitting United States senator, had strong incentive to prioritize investigating and dismantling the Silk Road. The relatively quiet, low-profile existence the marketplace had enjoyed during its first several months was now permanently gone. Ross had to know on some level that every additional day the site remained online increased the risk of eventually being identified, tracked down, and arrested. The rational, risk-averse choice, from a purely self-preservation standpoint, might have been to quietly shut the operation down, disappear back into anonymous civilian life, and walk away from the entire project while there was still time. Ross chose the opposite path entirely. Rather than retreating, he made the decision to expand, to professionalize, to lean directly into the sudden surge of new users and new attention, treating it not as a warning sign to be feared, but as validation, proof that his experiment in economic freedom had struck a genuine nerve, and demand from the public confirmed exactly what he had always believed, that people wanted and deserved the freedom to make their own choices without government interference. This decision reveals something crucial about Ross's psychology at this critical juncture. He wasn't simply a criminal calculating risk versus reward in purely financial terms. He was, in his own mind, a true believer, someone who saw the growing controversy as confirmation of his ideological mission rather than a flashing red warning sign urging caution or retreat. And so, in the months following the Gawker article and Senator Schumer's public condemnation, Ross began systematically transforming the Silk Road from a scrappy, informal experiment into something resembling a genuine, professionally run online business, albeit one built entirely around illegal commerce. One of the most significant changes he implemented during this period was the development of a robust seller feedback and rating system, deliberately modeled after the kind of trust-building infrastructure used by massive, entirely legal online marketplaces like eBay and Amazon. Think about how remarkable and, in its own twisted way, how ingenious this decision actually was. Buyers on the Silk Road could now view detailed histories for individual sellers, including star ratings, written reviews describing product quality, shipping speed, and packaging discretion, and running tallies of completed transactions. Sellers with consistently positive feedback would rise in visibility and credibility, attracting more buyers over time, while sellers who scammed customers, shipped low-quality products, or failed to deliver orders would quickly accumulate negative reviews, damaging their reputation within the community and driving away future business. This system solved one of the fundamental challenges facing any black market operation throughout history: the complete absence of trust between anonymous strangers engaging in an illegal transaction where neither party has any legal recourse if the other side cheats them. Traditionally, Illegal drug transactions relied on personal relationships, established criminal networks, or simply the implicit threat of violence to enforce basic honesty between buyers and sellers. Ross, drawing directly from his background studying free market economics, effectively built a decentralized, self enforcing reputation system instead, one where honesty and quality were incentivized not through fear or violence, but through the straightforward economic logic of accumulated reputation and repeat business. Dishonest sellers would naturally be filtered out over time, not through any centralized policing effort, but through the collective, aggregated judgment of thousands of individual buyers, each one contributing a small piece of publicly visible feedback. It was, in a deeply uncomfortable way, brilliant. Ross had essentially taken the trust and safety mechanisms of legitimate mainstream e commerce platforms and successfully applied them to one of the most dangerous, ethically fraught categories of commerce imaginable. The Silk Road began to feel, to its users, less like a shadowy criminal underworld and more like a legitimate, if illegal, online business, complete with customer service standards, quality expectations, and a genuine culture of professionalism among its most successful sellers. Alongside the reputation system, Ross also began implementing more sophisticated escrow arrangements, a financial safeguard designed to further build trust between anonymous buyers and sellers. Rather than sending Bitcoin payment directly to a seller upon placing an order, buyers would instead send their payment to the Silk Road platform itself, which would hold the funds securely in escrow until the buyer confirmed that their order had actually arrived as promised. Only then would the platform release payment to the seller, taking a small commission for itself in the process. This escrow system served multiple purposes simultaneously. It protected buyers from being scammed by dishonest sellers who might otherwise take payment and simply never ship the promised product. It protected honest sellers from buyers who might falsely claim they never received an order in an attempt to get their money back without actually returning any goods. And, perhaps most significantly for Ross personally, every transaction flowing through this escrow system generated a small commission for the platform itself, meaning that as more users joined and more transactions occurred, Ross's own personal earnings, quietly accumulating in Bitcoin, grew substantially larger with each passing month. Large. By implementing these systems, seller ratings, buyer reviews, secure escrow, dispute resolution processes, and increasingly detailed rules governing what could and could not be sold on the platform, Ross was in effect professionalizing crime itself. He was building the infrastructure of legitimate commerce and applying it with remarkable precision and thoughtfulness to an enterprise built entirely on illegal drug trafficking. As these changes took hold throughout the latter half of 2011, the Silk Road's growth accelerated dramatically. What had begun as a small, insular community of a few hundred technically sophisticated early adopters ballooned into a marketplace serving thousands and eventually tens of thousands of active users. The product catalog expanded well beyond the modest bag of mushrooms that had defined its first ever transaction, growing to include an enormous range of illegal substances, alongside, notably, an explicit set of rules Ross himself established, prohibiting the sale of certain categories of items he considered morally unacceptable, including weapons intended to cause harm and any material related to the exploitation of children. This detail matters because it reveals, once again, the deeply complicated psychology at the center of this entire story. Ross wasn't simply building an anarchic free-for-all with no rules whatsoever. He was constructing a carefully considered moral framework, one specifically designed around his personal interpretation of libertarian ethics, drawing a clear, deliberate line between what he considered legitimate, victimless commerce between consenting adults and what he considered genuinely harmful, exploitative behavior that had no place on his platform, regardless of how profitable it might have been to allow it. But as the Silk Road continued expanding at a rapid pace throughout the end of 2011 and into 2012, growing larger, more complex, and increasingly lucrative with every passing month, an entirely new set of challenges began to emerge. Challenges that had little to do with the original technical or philosophical problems Ross had already solved. Running a small, informal marketplace for a few hundred trusted early adopters was one thing. Running what was rapidly becoming a sprawling, multi-million dollar criminal enterprise, complete with thousands of active sellers, tens of thousands of active buyers, and an increasingly complex set of internal disputes, security concerns, and logistical challenges was an entirely different undertaking altogether. Ross could no longer manage everything alone. The empire he had built quietly, in the isolation of a rented room, was now far too large for a single person to oversee by himself, and that reality would soon force him into decisions and relationships that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. Chapter 5: An Empire in the Shadows, the Business Model of Evil. By the middle of 2012, the Silk Road had stopped resembling anything like a scrappy underground experiment. It had become, in almost every functional sense, a fully operational business. And to understand just how remarkable and how deeply unsettling that transformation actually was, we need to step back and examine the machinery Ross Ulbricht had built beneath the surface, the systems that turned a hidden website into something closer to a criminal corporation. Picture, for a moment, the experience of an ordinary buyer logging on to the Silk Road during this period. After connecting through the Tor network and typing in a long, unmemorable .onion address, they would arrive at a homepage that visually felt startlingly familiar. Clean layouts, organized categories, search filters, product thumbnails, star ratings beneath seller names. It looked, in almost every visual respect, like an ordinary online store, the kind of interface anyone who had ever shopped online would immediately recognize and understand. That familiarity was not accidental. It was, in fact, one of Ross's most important strategic decisions. By making the Silk Road feel intuitive and unthreatening, almost boring in its resemblance to legitimate e-commerce, he lowered the psychological barrier for new users. Buying illegal drugs no longer required navigating dangerous street corners or building trust with a stranger in a dimly lit parking lot. It required nothing more than the same basic skills anyone already possessed from browsing Amazon or eBay: search, compare, click, purchase, wait for delivery. Beneath that friendly surface, however, sat an increasingly sophisticated set of systems designed to keep the entire criminal ecosystem functioning smoothly. We've already explored the escrow system in the previous chapter, but by this stage in the Silk Road's evolution, it had grown considerably more refined. Funds sent by buyers were held securely by the platform itself until a transaction was confirmed as successfully completed, protecting both sides from fraud. But what happened when something actually went wrong? What happened when a buyer claimed their package never arrived, or a seller insisted they had shipped exactly what was promised? For these situations, Ross implemented a structured dispute resolution process, remarkably similar in spirit to the kind of customer service systems used by major legitimate retailers. And buyers and sellers could open a formal dispute, present their side of the situation, and have the matter reviewed by site administrators, who would then make a judgment call on how to resolve the disagreement, often splitting the disputed funds, or ruling in favor of one party based on the evidence presented, such as tracking numbers, message logs, or previous transaction history. There was, remarkably, something resembling actual customer service infrastructure operating within this criminal enterprise. Dedicated forum threads existed where users could ask questions, report problems, or seek guidance on how to safely use the platform. Experienced community members and paid site staff answered these questions patiently, walking newcomers through everything from basic security practices to properly encrypting a shipping address so that even Silk Road staff couldn't read it without the correct decryption key. This last detail deserves particular attention because it illustrates just how seriously security was treated within this hidden economy. Buyers were strongly encouraged and eventually required to encrypt their shipping addresses using a system called PGP, or Pretty Good Privacy, a form of public key cryptography that allowed a buyer to scramble their address into unreadable code, using a key that only the intended seller could decrypt. And this meant that even if law enforcement somehow managed to seize the Silk Road servers and access every message ever sent through the platform, buyer shipping addresses would remain protected, hidden behind another layer of encryption entirely separate from the anonymity already provided by Tor. Sellers, meanwhile, developed their own increasingly sophisticated methods for evading detection during the physical shipping process itself, since this represented one of the only points in the entire transaction where a truly physical, traceable object, a package containing illegal drugs, actually had to move through the real-world postal system. Vacuum sealing to prevent detection by drug sniffing dogs, false packaging designed to disguise contents, shipping methods carefully chosen to avoid triggering additional scrutiny from postal inspectors. Now let's turn to the product catalog itself, because its scale by this point in the Silk Road's development had become genuinely staggering. What had begun with a single modest listing for psilocybin mushrooms had expanded into a sprawling marketplace offering, according to later estimates compiled by federal investigators, tens of thousands of individual product listings. Cannabis and its various derivatives represented a significant portion of overall sales, alongside psychedelics like LSD, prescription pharmaceuticals sold without valid prescriptions, and more troublingly, harder, more dangerous substances, including cocaine and heroin. And yet, remarkably, Ross had established and actively enforced a specific set of prohibited categories, rules that reveal an enormous amount about his self perception during this period of his life. Weapons were explicitly banned from the platform, along with anything Ross classified as designed specifically to harm or defraud others, including stolen credit card information, counterfeit currency, and, perhaps most significantly, any material whatsoever related to the sexual exploitation of children, a category he treated with what appears to have been genuine, absolute moral revulsion. This is where the story forces us to confront one of its most uncomfortable, most psychologically complex dimensions. Ross Ulbricht did not see himself as a drug kingpin in any conventional sense. He did not view himself the way the public or federal prosecutors would eventually come to view him. In his own internal narrative, carefully constructed and reinforced through his persona as Dread Pirate Roberts, he saw himself as something closer to a principled revolutionary, a man drawing careful, deliberate moral lines, even while operating what was, by any objective measure, an enormous criminal enterprise. He permitted what he considered victimless transactions between consenting adults, while explicitly prohibiting anything he judged to genuinely harm innocent third parties. In his mind, this distinction mattered enormously. It allowed him to maintain an internal image of himself not as a criminal profiting from addiction and human suffering, but as something closer to a digital folk hero, a modern Robin Hood figure, standing defiantly against an oppressive government that, in his view, had no legitimate authority to dictate what adults could or could not choose to put into their own bodies. This self-image was actively cultivated and reinforced through Dread Pirate Roberts's public communications with the Silk Road community. In forum posts and public statements, he wrote extensively about libertarian philosophy, about the injustice of the war on drugs, about the moral superiority of voluntary exchange over government coercion. He positioned himself, quite deliberately, as an intellectual and philosophical leader, not merely the operator of a website, but the architect of an entire ideological movement, one that just happened to generate an enormous, continuously growing fortune along the way. And that fortune, by this point in the story, had become genuinely extraordinary. Every single transaction completed on the Silk Road generated a commission for the platform, typically ranging between roughly 8 and 15% of the total transaction value, depending on the size of the order. Multiply that commission structure across tens of thousands of transactions occurring every single month, and the resulting revenue became almost impossible to fully comprehend. Federal investigators would later estimate that over the full course of its operation, the Silk Road facilitated well over $1 billion in total transactions, generating tens of millions of dollars in commission revenue for Ross personally. And because virtually all of this revenue was collected in Bitcoin, a currency whose value was simultaneously gradually climbing throughout this exact period, Ross's personal wealth grew not only through the sheer volume of commissions he collected, but through the appreciating value of the Bitcoin itself, sitting quietly in digital wallets under his exclusive control. By Some later estimates, Ross's personal holdings, accumulated through years of Silk Road commissions, would eventually be valued at well over $100 million, even before accounting for the dramatic price increases Bitcoin would experience in the years following his arrest. Think about the sheer strangeness of this reality for a moment. Somewhere in the city of San Francisco, an unassuming young man living a relatively modest, low profile personal life was quietly one of the wealthiest secret individuals in the world, his fortune existing entirely as invisible strings of code hidden behind encrypted wallets that no bank, no government, and virtually no other human being on Earth even knew existed. But extraordinary success, particularly the kind built on secrecy and audacity, rarely goes unnoticed forever, even within the shadows of the internet's darkest corners. As the Silk Road's reputation and revenue continued growing throughout 2012, it began attracting exactly the kind of attention that success inevitably invites: competitors. A handful of smaller imitative marketplaces began appearing on the Tor network, each one attempting to replicate some version of the Silk Road's model, hoping to siphon off a portion of its rapidly growing user base and revenue. Most of these early competitors were poorly built, unstable, or simply lacked the trust and reputation the Silk Road had painstakingly built over nearly 2 years of operation. Many disappeared almost as quickly as they had emerged, unable to match the security, reliability, and community trust that had become the Silk Road's defining competitive advantage. But their existence signaled something important, something Ross himself surely recognized. The model he had pioneered was not only viable, it was replicable. The specific combination of Tor-based anonymity, Bitcoin-based payment, and eBay-style reputation systems that he had assembled through months of self-taught programming and careful strategic decision-making had proven itself, in dramatic fashion, as a genuinely functional business model. And where one person had proven a model worked, others, inevitably, would follow. This growing competitive pressure, combined with the sheer, overwhelming scale the Silk Road had reached by this point, created an entirely new set of operational challenges for Ross. The marketplace could no longer be managed by a single person, working alone late at night in a rented room, the way it had been during its earliest, most modest months of existence. Ross needed help, and getting help meant something that ran directly counter to every principle of anonymity and security he had so carefully built the entire operation around. He needed to trust other people. Throughout 2012 and into 2013, Dread Pirate Roberts began recruiting a small, trusted inner circle of site administrators and moderators, individuals who would help manage the increasingly complex daily operations of the marketplace. These included people responsible for resolving buyer and seller disputes, monitoring forum discussions for signs of scams or security breaches, and, in some cases, individuals who took on increasingly significant technical or managerial responsibilities within the platform's growing internal structure. Each new person brought into this inner circle represented, quite literally, a new potential point of failure in an operation whose entire foundation depended on absolute secrecy. Every additional administrator, every additional moderator, every additional person who knew even a fragment of information about how the Silk Road actually operated behind the scenes represented one more possible thread that could, if pulled hard enough by the right investigator, eventually unravel back toward Ross's true identity. Ross seemed acutely aware of this risk and took what he believed were sufficient precautions, communicating with his inner circle exclusively through encrypted channels, compartmentalizing information so that no single administrator possessed complete knowledge of the entire operation, and maintaining strict operational security protocols designed to prevent any single arrest or compromise from cascading into a broader collapse of the entire enterprise. But precautions, no matter how carefully designed, cannot eliminate risk entirely, particularly when an operation grows large enough to require dozens of moving parts, multiple servers spread across different countries, and an expanding circle of individuals who each, in their own way, held a piece of the puzzle. And by early 2013, the Silk Road had grown large enough, wealthy enough, and notorious enough that it had become impossible for federal law enforcement to continue treating it as a minor, low-priority nuisance. Dafür, less. Behind the scenes, in offices belonging to agencies including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Department of Homeland Security, dedicated teams of agents and analysts had begun quietly assembling a coordinated, methodical investigation, one specifically aimed at identifying the true identity of the person operating under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. These investigators faced an extraordinarily difficult challenge, one that had defeated previous, smaller-scale attempts to identify and dismantle earlier iterations of anonymous online marketplaces. How do you identify a single individual hiding behind layers of encrypted anonymity, operating a website whose physical server location was deliberately, technically impossible to trace through conventional means? The answer, as it would eventually turn out, would not come from breaking the encryption itself. Tor and Bitcoin, when used correctly, remained remarkably resistant to direct technical attacks throughout this entire period. Instead, the eventual unraveling of the Silk Road would come from something far more human, far more mundane, and, in its own way, far more inevitable. Small, seemingly insignificant mistakes made months, sometimes even years earlier, before Ross had fully understood just how careful he would eventually need to be. Somewhere, buried in old forum posts, forgotten early advertisements, and casual conversations Ross had participated in long before the Silk Road had grown into the empire it would eventually become, tiny threads of digital evidence sat quietly waiting to be discovered by investigators, patient and thorough enough to find them. The hunt for Dread Pirate Roberts had officially begun. Chapter 6, Hunters in the Dark. The FBI joins the chase. Every empire, no matter how carefully hidden, eventually draws the attention of those whose job it is to find it. And by early 2013, the Silk Road had grown far too large, far too profitable, and far too embarrassing to federal authorities to remain a low-priority case buried somewhere in a stack of unsolved cybercrime files. Across multiple federal agencies, dedicated investigators had begun quietly assembling what would become one of the most complex digital manhunts in the history of American law enforcement. This wasn't a single, unified task force working in perfect coordination from day one. It was, in reality, a patchwork of separate investigations run by different agencies, often unaware of exactly how far the others had progressed, all converging, slowly and independently, toward the same elusive target: the true identity of the man hiding behind the name Dread Pirate Roberts. Among the key figures who would eventually become central to this investigation was Christopher Tarbell, a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation who specialized in cybercrime. Tarbell had built his career pursuing sophisticated online criminals, individuals who believed, often correctly for years at a time, that the anonymity of the internet made them essentially untouchable. He understood, perhaps better than most investigators of his era, that catching someone like Dread Pirate Roberts wouldn't happen through brute force or conventional police work. It would require patience, technical sophistication, and an almost obsessive attention to detail, the willingness to comb through thousands of pages of digital records, searching for the tiny, almost invisible mistakes that even the most careful criminals inevitably make. Alongside agents like Tarbell, another crucial figure entered the investigation from a different angle entirely. Jared Der Yegiayan, an agent working with the Department of Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Division, had initially become involved in the case through an entirely different route: intercepted packages. As small quantities of drugs shipped through the Silk Road began appearing in seized mail parcels passing through customs facilities, particularly at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, Der Yehiayan found himself pulled deeper and deeper into the world of this mysterious online marketplace, eventually becoming one of the most dedicated, most personally invested investigators pursuing Dread Pirate Roberts. What makes this phase of the story so compelling isn't simply the eventual outcome, which most listeners likely already know in broad strokes. It's the sheer difficulty, the almost impossible nature of the challenge these investigators faced at the outset. Think for a moment about exactly what these agents were up against. The Silk Road servers were hidden behind the Tor network, specifically engineered so that tracing a connection back to its physical real-world location was, by design, extraordinarily difficult, arguably close to technically impossible when system was used correctly. Every transaction flowed through Bitcoin, a currency built specifically to avoid the kind of centralized record keeping that traditionally allowed investigators to simply subpoena a bank and request account information tied to a real name. Even communication between buyers, sellers, and site administrators was frequently encrypted using tools like PGP, adding yet another layer of protection against anyone attempting to intercept and read private messages. In essence, investigators were attempting to identify a single individual who had spent years deliberately, methodically constructing systems whose entire purpose was to make exactly that kind of identification impossible. It would be like trying to find a specific person hiding somewhere within a city of 10 million people, where every street sign has been removed, every building looks identical, and the person you're searching for has spent years studying in obsessive detail precisely how to remain invisible within that city's structure. For months, progress remained frustratingly slow. Investigators pursued numerous leads that ultimately went nowhere, chased false trails left behind by red herrings, and grappled with the sheer technical complexity of an investigation unlike almost anything American law enforcement had previously encountered at this scale. But as is so often the case in stories like this one, the eventual breakthrough didn't come from some sophisticated technical exploit that cracked the encryption protecting Tor or Bitcoin. It came from something far more human, far more mundane, and in hindsight, almost painfully avoidable. An old, seemingly forgotten mistake made long before Ross fully understood just how careful he would eventually need to become. Sometime in the middle of 2013, investigators working the case began systematically searching across the broader internet for any early mentions of the Silk Road, hoping to find some trace of who might have originally created and promoted the site, back before it had grown into the sprawling, sophisticated operation it had since become. This kind of painstaking digital archaeology, searching through old forum posts, cached web pages, and internet archives, would prove to be exactly the right approach. What they eventually discovered was a post on Bitcoin Talk, one of the earliest and most prominent online forums dedicated to discussions about the fledgling cryptocurrency. The post, dated all the way back to January of 2011, just days after the Silk Road had quietly launched, had been made by a user with the screen name Altoid. In this post, Altoid casually mentioned the existence of a new website called the Silk Road, describing it in relatively vague terms as an anonymous online marketplace and inviting curious forum members to check it out for themselves. On its own, this single post might have meant relatively little. After all, thousands of people had discussed the Silk Road online by this point, particularly following the wave of media attention triggered by the Gawker article and Senator Schumer's public condemnation back in 2011. But investigators, with characteristic thoroughness, decided to dig further, searching to see whether this same username, Altoid, had made any other posts elsewhere across the internet on other forums discussing other topics entirely. What they found next would prove to be the single most consequential mistake in the entire history of the Silk Road's operation. On a completely different forum, one dedicated not to cryptocurrency but to psilocybin mushrooms, called Shroomery, investigators located another post made by the same username, Altoid, dated even earlier than the Bitcoin Talk post. But this particular post contained something far more specific, far more dangerous to the operator's anonymity than a casual mention of a new website. In this post, Altoid was seeking help with a technical programming question, and in doing so, had included a personal email address as a way for other forum members to contact him directly with assistance. That email address was rossulbricht@gmail.com. It's worth pausing here to fully absorb the significance of this discovery, because it represents, in many ways, the entire turning point of this investigation. After months of pursuing a target who had built an extraordinarily sophisticated, technically robust system of anonymity, layering encrypted networks on top of untraceable currency, on top of carefully compartmentalized communications, Investigators had finally caught their break, not through some brilliant technical exploit, but through a simple, almost embarrassingly ordinary human error. A forgotten forum post made years earlier, before the stakes had grown so extraordinarily high, containing a real name embedded directly within an email address. This is a pattern that appears again and again throughout the history of major cybercrime investigations, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because it reveals something important about human psychology under pressure, or perhaps more accurately, human psychology in the absence of pressure. In January of 2011, when Altoid made these early posts, the Silk Road was nothing more than a small, obscure experiment visited by a handful of curious early adopters. Ross, at that early stage, likely had no meaningful concept of the empire this project would eventually become, no sense that federal investigators would one day be scouring the darkest, most forgotten corners of the internet, searching specifically for any trace connecting his real identity to this fledgling marketplace. The extreme operational security measures he would later adopt, the careful compartmentalization, the strict use of encrypted communications, simply didn't exist yet in those very first casual, unguarded weeks. It was, in the end, his past self, the version of Ross who existed before he fully understood what he was building, who ultimately betrayed his future self. But a single email address, however suggestive, wasn't quite enough on its own to justify an arrest. Investigators needed to build a stronger, more comprehensive case, one that could withstand the intense legal scrutiny that would inevitably come with prosecuting a figure as significant as Dread Pirate Roberts. Armed with this crucial new lead, investigators began digging deeper into Ross Ulbricht's broader digital footprint, cross-referencing his real name, his known email addresses, and his documented history across various online platforms. They discovered additional forum posts made under different usernames in which Ross had discussed topics closely related to libertarian economics, Austrian economic theory, and, notably, questions about the legal and ethical implications of running an anonymous online marketplace, questions posted again in those very early, less guarded days before the full weight of what he was building had truly set in. Simultaneously, a separate but equally crucial thread of investigation was unfolding on a purely technical level. Investigators specializing in server infrastructure and network forensics had been meticulously analyzing the digital architecture supporting the Silk Road itself, searching for any configuration errors, any moments where the site's servers might have inadvertently leaked information that could help reveal their true physical location, despite being routed through the Tor network. Eventually, investigators identified what appeared to be a server misconfiguration, a technical oversight that, under certain specific circumstances, allowed a small amount of identifying information to leak outside the protective layers of Tor's anonymization system. This discovery allowed investigators to trace a portion of the Silk Road's server infrastructure back to a specific data center, providing yet another crucial piece connecting the abstract, anonymous entity known as Dread Pirate Roberts to concrete, physical, real-world infrastructure. By the summer of 2013, these separate threads of investigation, the forgotten forum posts, the leaked server information, months of painstaking digital forensics, had converged into something investigators felt increasingly confident about. They now believed, with growing certainty, that the individual operating under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts was, in fact, a 29-year-old man from Austin, Texas, currently residing in San Francisco, named Ross William Ulbricht. This moment deserves genuine dramatic weight because it represents an extraordinary achievement in digital investigation, one that would go on to influence how law enforcement agencies around the world approached similar cases involving anonymous online criminal enterprises in the years that followed. Investigators had successfully unmasked one of the most technically sophisticated, most deliberately anonymous criminals in the history of the internet, not through some dramatic technological breakthrough, but through patient, methodical, almost archaeological digital detective work, painstakingly reconstructing a digital trail that Ross himself likely believed had been permanently erased years earlier. But identifying a suspect and successfully prosecuting them are two very different challenges entirely, particularly in a case as legally and technically complex as this one. Investigators understood quite clearly that simply believing Ross Ulbricht was Dread Pirate Roberts wasn't sufficient grounds for an arrest, at least not the kind of clean, legally airtight arrest that would guarantee a successful prosecution. They needed something far more concrete: direct, undeniable evidence connecting Ross in real time to active administrative control over the Silk Road platform itself. Ideally, they needed to catch him in the exact act of accessing the site's back-end systems, logged in as an administrator with his laptop open and unencrypted at the precise moment of arrest. This requirement created an extraordinarily delicate operational challenge. Ross needed to be under close, continuous surveillance without ever suspecting that federal investigators had identified him. Any premature move, any indication that he had become aware he was being watched, risked giving him enough warning to destroy critical evidence, encrypt his laptop, or disappear entirely, potentially rebuilding the Silk Road under an entirely new identity, in an entirely new location, with investigators forced to start their painstaking work all over again from scratch. Throughout the late summer and early autumn of 2013, investigators quietly began surveilling Ross Ulbricht's daily movements throughout San Francisco, tracking his patterns, his routines, the locations he frequented, all while maintaining absolute secrecy about the true purpose behind this surveillance. And remarkably, throughout this entire period, Ross appeared to remain completely unaware that he was being watched. He continued operating the Silk Road with what investigators would later describe as striking, almost startling confidence, logging into the platform's administrative systems from public locations, including coffee shops and eventually the public library that would ultimately become the site of his arrest. It's genuinely difficult to imagine the psychological tension building on both sides of this unfolding drama during these final weeks. Investigators, increasingly confident in their identification of Ross as Dread Pirate Roberts, carefully monitoring his movements, waiting patiently for the precise moment when they could catch him with his laptop open and unencrypted, administrative access clearly visible on his screen. And Ross himself, quietly continuing to manage his sprawling criminal empire, seemingly unaware that federal agents were now tracking his every move, watching him from a careful, invisible distance. But even as this final surveillance operation quietly unfolded, an entirely separate, far darker storyline was simultaneously developing within the Silk Road's own internal operations, one that had nothing directly to do with the ongoing federal investigation, but which would eventually raise deeply disturbing questions about exactly how far Ross Ulbricht had strayed from his original idealistic vision of a peaceful, voluntary marketplace built on libertarian principles. Somewhere within the encrypted messages and internal communications investigators had begun quietly monitoring, disturbing conversations were taking place, conversations suggesting that Dread Pirate Roberts had begun exploring options that went far beyond simply running an anonymous drug marketplace. Conversations that would eventually raise deeply troubling allegations about violence, betrayal, and the increasingly desperate lengths one man might go to in order to protect an empire he had spent years building from nothing. Chapter 7: Blood in the Shadows, the disputed murder-for-hire allegations. Every story about idealism has a moment where the mask begins to slip. For Ross Ulbricht, that moment arrived not through some dramatic public event, but quietly, hidden within encrypted chat logs that federal investigators had begun collecting during their surveillance of the Silk Road's internal operations. What those logs allegedly revealed would complicate, permanently and profoundly, the story Ross had spent years telling himself about who he was and what he was building. Before going further, it's important to establish something clearly and carefully, because this chapter deals with some of the most legally contested territory in the entire Silk Road saga. The allegations we're about to discuss were never presented as formal charges in the main criminal trial that ultimately convicted Ross Ulbricht in New York. They surfaced separately in a different jurisdiction, and for a variety of legal and procedural reasons, none of these specific murder-for-hire allegations ever resulted in a criminal conviction. What we can discuss, based on court filings, prosecutorial statements, and investigative reporting, are the allegations themselves and the chat logs prosecutors say they obtained, understanding that allegations and convictions are two very different things. With that said, these allegations remain a critical, unavoidable part of understanding the full arc of this story, because of what they suggest about the psychological transformation Ross may have undergone as the pressures of running an increasingly massive, increasingly scrutinized criminal enterprise began to mount. According to federal prosecutors, sometime in early 2013, Dread Pirate Roberts became convinced that one of his own employees, a Silk Road site administrator who moderated under the username FryDog, had betrayed his trust in a serious way, allegedly by stealing a significant sum of Bitcoin from the platform, funds belonging to Silk Road users that had been entrusted to the site through its escrow system. For a marketplace whose entire reputation and entire business model depended on trust, on buyers and sellers believing their funds were secure within the platform's escrow system, this kind of internal theft represented an existential threat. If word spread that Silk Road administrators themselves were stealing from users, the carefully built reputation system that had taken years to establish could collapse almost overnight, taking the entire operation down with it. According to chat logs prosecutors later presented in court filings, Dread Pirate Roberts began communicating with someone he believed to be a representative of a Hells Angels affiliated criminal organization, discussing the possibility of having this employee tracked down and violently punished in order to send an unmistakable message to anyone else within the organization who might consider similar betrayal. The messages, as characterized in court documents, described a request to have the employee, whose real identity Dread Pirate Roberts believed he had uncovered through the employee's own login information, physically confronted, and to have the situation handled in a way that would ensure the stolen funds were returned and that this kind of internal betrayal would never happen again. Prosecutors allege that Dread Pirate Roberts ultimately paid approximately $80,000 in Bitcoin for this service to be carried out. What makes this specific incident particularly strange and particularly revealing about the murky, difficult to verify nature of these allegations is what happened afterward. No such violent act was ever confirmed to have actually taken place. No victim was ever identified. No body was ever found. Law enforcement, after extensive investigation, was never able to determine that a real person was actually harmed in connection with this specific request. This has led to considerable public debate, both at the time and in the years since, about whether Ross had, in fact, contracted a legitimate criminal organization capable of carrying out violence, or whether he had unknowingly been communicating with an undercover federal agent, or possibly even a scammer posing as a hired enforcer, taking his Bitcoin payment without ever intending to harm anyone at all. This uncertainty matters enormously to how we understand this chapter of the story, and it's worth sitting with the complexity honestly rather than flattening it into a simpler narrative than the evidence actually supports. But this was not the only such allegation prosecutors would eventually bring forward. In a separate and, in some ways, even more serious set of allegations, prosecutors in the state of Maryland pursued charges related to accusations that Dread Pirate Roberts had solicited the murder of a separate individual, a Canadian man named Curtis Green, who had also served as a Silk Road site administrator after Green was arrested by law enforcement, and prosecutors alleged Dread Pirate Roberts feared Green might cooperate with investigators and expose information that could compromise the entire operation. According to chat logs presented in these Maryland proceedings, Dread Pirate Roberts allegedly paid approximately $80,000 to have Green killed, communicating again with individuals prosecutors described as connected to organized crime networks, requesting proof that the killing had actually occurred. What happened next reveals just how strange and layered this entire episode truly was. The proof of death that Dread Pirate Roberts allegedly received, and apparently believed to be genuine, staged photographs depicting Green's apparent murder, was later revealed to have been fabricated entirely by law enforcement officials themselves. Curtis Green, it turned out, had actually already been arrested by federal agents and was, at the time these staged photographs were allegedly created and sent, cooperating with the very investigation that was closing in on Ross Ulbricht. In other words, according to these allegations, Ross believed he had successfully ordered and paid for a man's murder, when in reality, that man was alive in federal custody and actively assisting the investigation that would soon lead to Ross's own arrest. It's difficult to overstate how significant this detail is to understanding the psychological arc of this story if these allegations are accurate. This wasn't a hypothetical moral compromise, a philosophical debate about the ethics of an anonymous marketplace facilitating drug sales between consenting adults. This was, according to prosecutors, a direct, deliberate decision to end a human life, made not in a moment of panic or self-defense, but as a calculated business decision intended to protect the security and profitability of an ongoing criminal enterprise. And this brings us to the deeper, more uncomfortable question that this chapter of the story forces us to confront. A question that extends well beyond the specific facts of any individual allegation, and speaks instead to something more universal about power, ideology, and moral erosion over time. Ross Ulbricht began this entire journey, as we explored back in Chapter 1, as a young man motivated by a genuine, deeply held philosophical conviction. He believed, with apparent sincerity, that government prohibition of drugs caused far more harm than the drugs themselves, that violence in the drug trade stemmed not from the substances being sold, but from their criminalized, unregulated status, forcing transactions into dangerous, unaccountable black markets, policed only by the threat of violence rather than by law. And yet, according to these very allegations, the man who built a marketplace explicitly designed to remove violence from the drug trade may have himself resorted to ordering violence, real or attempted, in order to protect that very marketplace from internal threats and external exposure. This is, in many ways, one of the most disturbing and psychologically revealing threads running through the entire Silk Road saga. It raises a question that echoes far beyond this single case, one that appears again and again throughout the history of ambitious, ideologically driven ventures that begin with genuine idealism and gradually, sometimes almost imperceptibly, drift toward increasingly extreme and compromised behavior in service of self-preservation. And how does someone who genuinely believes he is fighting against a corrupt, coercive system end up, according to these allegations, becoming willing to order the killing of another human being to protect his own operation? Was this always latent within Ross, a capacity for violence that simply hadn't been tested until circumstances demanded it? Or did something change, gradually, almost invisibly, as the stakes grew larger, as the fortune grew larger, as the sheer scale of what he had built grew large enough that its collapse would mean not just financial loss, but potentially decades in federal prison? There's an old, well-worn phrase that captures this dynamic with unsettling precision. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Ross, operating under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts, had accumulated a genuinely extraordinary, almost unprecedented form of unchecked power. He was, within the world he had built, simultaneously the founder, the sole owner, the chief executive, and in many practical respects, the judge, jury, founder, and enforcer of whatever rules he chose to establish. There was no board of directors to answer to, no regulatory body providing oversight, no legal system he recognized as legitimate, watching over his decisions. Within the walls of the Silk Road, Ross's word, quite literally, was law. And when an environment like that faces a genuine internal threat, an employee allegedly stealing funds, a former administrator potentially cooperating with federal investigators, the normal checks that might restrain someone in a conventional business environment, the fear of legal consequences, the involvement of law enforcement, the oversight of partners or shareholders, simply didn't exist. There was a legitimate system Ross could turn to for justice, precisely because his entire enterprise existed specifically to operate outside any legitimate system altogether. This created, according to what these allegations suggest, a deeply dangerous vacuum, one where Ross may have felt that violence, or the threat of violence, was the only tool remaining available to him to protect what he had built. And the same libertarian philosophy that had once justified his marketplace as a peaceful alternative to government coercion may have, in this darker moment, been twisted into a justification for taking the law entirely into his own hands. deciding unilaterally who deserved to live and who deserved to die in order to protect his empire. It's worth noting, in fairness to the historical record, that Ross Ulbricht has consistently denied these specific allegations, and his legal defense has argued that these chat logs, even if authentic, may not accurately represent genuine murder for hire arrangements, but rather could reflect Ross being deceived, manipulated, or even scammed by individuals falsely claiming to be capable of violence in order to extract Bitcoin payments from him. Because no bodies were ever found, and because these specific charges were never fully litigated to conviction, the true nature of what actually happened and what Ross genuinely believed at the time remains, in important respects, unresolved. But regardless of the ultimate legal outcome of these specific allegations, their psychological weight within this broader narrative is undeniable. Once these chat logs became part of the public record, once law enforcement began treating Dread Pirate Roberts not merely as an operator of an anonymous drug marketplace, but as someone potentially willing to order real-world violence to protect that marketplace, the entire moral framing of this case shifted permanently. The image Ross had carefully cultivated of himself and had projected to his community of a principled digital Robin Hood standing defiantly against government overreach, fighting for a more just and voluntary economic system, became, for many observers, impossible to sustain alongside these disturbing allegations. Whatever idealistic seeds had originally inspired this project back in a quiet Texas childhood, back in university lecture halls filled with Austrian economic theory, appeared to have been buried, at least according to these specific allegations, beneath something far darker: a willingness to order the death of another human being simply to protect an accumulating fortune and a rapidly expanding criminal enterprise. For federal investigators, meanwhile, these discoveries added an entirely new dimension of urgency to their already intensifying pursuit. What had begun in earlier stages of the investigation as primarily a complex financial and drug trafficking case now carried the added weight of potential violent crime, transforming the operation from a determined but methodical pursuit into something approaching a genuine race against time. If Dread Pirate Roberts truly was willing to order violence against perceived threats to his operation, investigators needed to move carefully, deliberately, but also with an increased sense of genuine urgency, understanding that every additional week the investigation continued represented not just an ongoing criminal marketplace, but potentially an ongoing threat to human life as well. By the late summer of 2013, all of these separate threads, the forgotten forum posts that had finally exposed Ross's true identity, the server misconfiguration that had traced Silk Road's infrastructure back to real-world locations, and now these deeply disturbing allegations of violence and murder for hire had converged into a singular, unmistakable conclusion among the investigators pursuing this case. The time for careful, patient surveillance was coming to an end. It was time to move. Somewhere in San Francisco, Ross Ulbricht continued his daily routine, apparently unaware that federal agents were now watching his every move with growing urgency, waiting only for the precise, carefully chosen moment when they could catch him with undeniable proof, his own hands on the keyboard, actively logged into the very systems that would finally conclusively unmask Dread Pirate Roberts once and for all. That moment, one that would end an empire built over nearly 3 years, was now only weeks away. Chapter 8, The Glen Park Library, The Moment of Collapse by the Final Days of September 2013. Federal investigators had assembled nearly everything they needed. They knew, with a high degree of confidence, that Ross Ulbricht was Dread Pirate Roberts. They had traced fragments of server infrastructure back to real-world locations. They had disturbing chat logs suggesting a willingness to order violence against perceived threats. What they still lacked was the one piece of evidence that would make a conviction virtually unassailable in court. Proof, captured in the exact moment it happened, that Ross himself was the person actively logged into the Silk Road's administrative systems, controlling the site in real time. This requirement shaped everything about how the final phase of the investigation would unfold. An arrest based purely on circumstantial evidence, however compelling, risked a lengthy legal battle in which defense attorneys could argue that someone else had actually operated the site, or that the digital trail connecting Ross to Dread Pirate Roberts was open to alternative interpretation. Investigators needed something far more direct. They needed to catch him with his hands, quite literally, on the controls. Throughout the final weeks of September, surveillance teams had been quietly tracking Ross's daily movements across San Francisco. What they observed was a pattern that would ultimately determine both the timing and the location of his arrest. Ross had developed a habit of working from public spaces, coffee shops, and, with increasing frequency, the Glen Park branch of the San Francisco Public Library, a modest, unassuming neighborhood building tucked into a residential part of the city, the kind of place most people would walk past without a second glance. There is something worth pausing on here, a detail that captures the strange, almost absurd contrast at the heart of this entire story. One of the most consequential criminal investigations in the history of American law enforcement was about to reach its climax, not in a dramatic raid on a fortified compound, not in a high-speed chase through city streets, but inside a quiet public library, surrounded by students studying for exams, retirees reading newspapers, and children browsing picture books in a nearby section. The banality of the setting stood in almost surreal contrast to the scale of what was actually happening inside it. On October 1st, 2013, investigators put their carefully constructed plan into motion. The operation had been designed with meticulous attention to detail, built specifically around one critical requirement. Agents needed to physically seize Ross's laptop while it was open, unlocked, and actively logged into the Silk Road's administrative backend before he had any chance to close the lid, trigger an automatic encryption lock, or otherwise cut off access to the system. Laptops, particularly ones belonging to someone as security conscious as Dread Pirate Roberts, could be configured to encrypt their entire contents within seconds of being closed or losing power, a safeguard that, if triggered, would have rendered the machine essentially useless as evidence, no matter how many agents surrounded him. This meant that a conventional arrest, agents approaching directly, announcing themselves, demanding he step away from the computer, carried an unacceptable risk. Even a few seconds of warning might be enough for someone as technically sophisticated as Ross to slam the laptop shut, instantly locking investigators out of the very evidence they had spent years working to obtain. So instead, agents devised something more subtle, more theatrical, in a sense, a plan built around misdirection rather than force. That afternoon, Ross arrived at the Glen Park Library and settled into his usual spot, a table positioned near the back of the building, close to the science fiction section, with a clear view of the surrounding area, a habit consistent with someone who valued being able to see who was approaching him. He opened his laptop, connected to the library's public Wi-Fi network, and began the process of logging into the Silk Road's administrative systems, unaware that the two people seated nearby, appearing to be an ordinary young couple, were in fact undercover federal agents, positioned there specifically to watch and wait for exactly this moment. According to later accounts from those involved in the operation, the agents had been instructed to wait until they could visually confirm that Ross was logged in as an administrator, actively navigating the back-end systems of the Silk Road before making any move at all. Centride. Every second mattered. Every moment of hesitation risked losing the narrow window of opportunity they had spent years working toward. Then, the plan shifted into motion. The undercover agents posing as a couple began a loud, seemingly spontaneous argument, the kind of minor public disturbance that instinctively draws attention in a quiet space like a library. Voices raised, a brief, heated exchange. Exactly the kind of moment that causes nearby heads to turn, including, according to accounts of the operation, Ross's own attention, drawn, even if only briefly, away from his screen toward the commotion unfolding just a few feet away. In that narrow window of distraction, another agent moved quickly and decisively from behind Ross, reaching past him and physically grabbing the open laptop directly off the table in a single, deliberate motion before he had any real chance to react, let alone close the lid or reach for the keyboard. Within seconds, additional agents closed in, identifying themselves, and Ross Ulbricht, 29 years old, sitting in a quiet corner of a public library on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, was placed under arrest. It's worth taking a moment to sit with just how quickly this moment unfolded, in stark contrast to the years of painstaking, methodical investigative work that had led up to it. An operation that had involved dozens of investigators across multiple federal agencies, years of digital forensics, surveillance, and careful legal preparation ultimately came down to a matter of seconds, a staged argument, and a single, precisely timed grab for an open laptop. When agents examined the seized computer immediately following the arrest, what they found confirmed everything they had spent years working to prove. The laptop was open, unlocked, and logged directly into the Silk Road's administrative dashboard, the very back-end control panel used to manage the entire marketplace, complete with active access to user accounts, financial records, and the site's core operational systems. This was not circumstantial evidence, open to alternative interpretation or legal argument about who might have actually been controlling the account. This was Ross Ulbricht, physically present, actively logged in, at the exact moment federal agents took him into custody. For investigators who had spent years chasing an almost invisible target, hidden behind layers of encryption and anonymity specifically engineered to prevent exactly this kind of identification, this moment represented an extraordinary vindication. The man behind Dread Pirate Roberts, the architect of an anonymous marketplace that had facilitated well over $1 billion in illegal transactions, the individual allegedly connected to disturbing murder for hire allegations, had finally been caught, not through some dramatic technological breakthrough, but through old-fashioned patience, careful planning, and a precisely executed moment of misdirection inside an ordinary neighborhood library. The scale of what agents found on that laptop and on subsequent devices and accounts connected to Ross would take investigators weeks and months to fully catalog. Among the most significant discoveries was access to Bitcoin wallets containing an enormous quantity of the cryptocurrency, accumulated over nearly 3 years of Silk Road commissions. Federal authorities would go on to seize tens of thousands of individual Bitcoin, at the time worth tens of millions of dollars, though, as we'll explore in a later chapter, the true value of this seizure would grow into something almost unimaginable in the years that followed. As Bitcoin's price climbed to levels no one, including federal investigators at the time, could have reasonably predicted. In the immediate aftermath of the arrest, the Silk Road website itself was seized and taken offline by federal authorities, replaced with a formal notice announcing that the site had been shut down as part of a law enforcement action, along with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other participating agencies. For the tens of thousands of active users who had come to rely on the marketplace, buyers and sellers alike, the platform they had used in many cases for years simply vanished overnight without warning. The public reaction to the arrest was immediate and intense. Within hours, news outlets around the world were reporting on the story, revealing for the first time the true identity behind the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts, a name that had existed until that exact moment as little more than a shadowy legend within certain corners of the internet. Photographs of Ross Ulbricht, a clean-cut, unremarkable-looking young man, began circulating widely, creating an almost jarring cognitive dissonance for many observers. This was the person behind one of the largest, most sophisticated criminal marketplaces in the history of the internet? This ordinary-looking graduate student from Texas? Federal prosecutors moved quickly to formally charge Ross with a lengthy list of serious crimes, including narcotics trafficking conspiracy, money laundering conspiracy, computer hacking conspiracy, and separately, in different jurisdictions, allegations connected to the murder for hire chat logs discussed in the previous chapter. The scale and complexity of the charges reflected the sheer scope of what investigators believed Ross had built and operated over nearly 3 years. For the broader online community that had grown up around the Silk Road, users, sellers, and observers who had followed the mythology of Dread Pirate Roberts for years, the arrest represented something almost impossible to fully process. The man many had come to view as a kind of digital folk hero, a principled revolutionary standing against government overreach, had been revealed quite suddenly, quite publicly, to be an ordinary human being, now facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. It's worth pausing here to reflect on the broader significance of this moment, beyond the specific details of Ross Ulbricht's individual case. The arrest represented one of the first major high-profile demonstrations that anonymity on the internet, however sophisticated the underlying technology, was not in fact absolute. Tor could hide a physical location. Bitcoin could obscure a financial trail. Encryption could protect private communications. But none of these tools could fully protect against old-fashioned human error. Forgotten forum posts made years earlier, careless mistakes made before the full weight of what was being built had truly set in, or the simple, unavoidable reality that at some point, a real human being has to sit down at a real keyboard in a real physical location to actually operate a system, no matter how well hidden that system might otherwise be. This lesson would go on to shape how law enforcement agencies around the world approached similar cases in the years that followed, and it would also shape how the next generation of anonymous online criminal enterprises attempted to protect themselves, learning in various ways from the specific mistakes that had ultimately brought down the Silk Road and unmasked Dread Pirate Roberts. But for Ross Ulbricht personally, sitting in a federal holding cell in the immediate aftermath of his arrest, the collapse of nearly 3 years of careful work, meticulous planning, and, in his own mind, genuine idealistic conviction had happened in the span of what likely felt like mere seconds. The empire he had built from nothing, starting in a small rented room with little more than a laptop and a philosophical conviction, an empire that had grown to facilitate well over $1 billion in transactions, that had made him secretly one of the wealthiest young men in the world, that had, according to serious allegations, led him down a path toward ordering violence against perceived threats, had ended, in an instant, inside the quiet, unremarkable confines of a neighborhood public library. The arrest, however, was only the beginning of the next chapter in this saga, not the conclusion of it. A formal criminal trial still lay ahead, one that would force the American legal system and the broader public watching closely from around the world to grapple directly with an extraordinarily complex set of questions. How should the justice system treat a nonviolent, ideologically motivated crime that nonetheless facilitated an almost unimaginable scale of illegal drug distribution? What weight should be given to disturbing allegations of violence that had never actually resulted in confirmed harm and had never been formally proven in a court of law? And ultimately, what sentence could possibly be considered appropriate or proportionate for a crime this unprecedented in scale, this legally and morally complex in its underlying details? These were the questions that would come to define the next deeply consequential phase of Ross Ulbricht's story, as the case moved from the quiet, hidden world of digital investigation into the bright, unforgiving spotlight of a New York City federal courtroom. Chapter 9, The Trial of the Century, Ideology Against Justice. By the time Ross Ulbricht's criminal trial began in a federal courtroom in Manhattan in January of 2015, more than a year had passed since his arrest inside the Glen Park Library. That year had given both the prosecution and the defense ample time to prepare for what would become one of the most closely watched criminal trials of the decade, a case that forced a courtroom, and by extension the wider public, to grapple with questions that extended far beyond the guilt or innocence of a single defendant. The atmosphere inside the courthouse during those weeks carried a particular kind of tension, distinct from a typical criminal trial. Reporters from major national and international news outlets filled the gallery day after day. Legal analysts, technology journalists, and curious members of the public packed the courtroom, drawn by the sheer novelty and scale of the case. This wasn't simply a trial about drug trafficking. It was, in many ways, the first major courtroom reckoning with an entirely new category of crime, one built on cryptography, anonymous networks, and digital currency, concepts that many jurors, and indeed much of the public, were only beginning to understand. Ross Ulbricht sat at the defense table each day, appearing by most accounts calm and composed, dressed neatly, looking very much like the clean-cut graduate student he had once been, rather than the shadowy criminal mastermind federal prosecutors were preparing to portray him as. Then through this visual contrast, the ordinary, unassuming young man sitting quietly in a suit juxtaposed against the almost mythic scale of the crimes being described in the courtroom, would become one of the defining visual elements of the entire trial. The defense strategy, led by Ross's attorney Joshua Drattel, centered on a narrative that acknowledged certain undeniable facts while attempting to reframe Ross's role within the larger story of the Silk Road in a fundamentally different light. The defense did not attempt to argue that Ross had no connection whatsoever to the Silk Road. The digital evidence, including the laptop seized during his arrest, made that particular argument essentially impossible to sustain. Instead, the defense pursued a more nuanced, more legally complex strategy. They argued that while Ross had indeed founded the Silk Road, largely as the kind of philosophical experiment we explored back in Chapter 1, he had subsequently stepped back from day-to-day operational control of the platform, handing over the reins to other unidentified individuals, and that the person who had continued operating under the name Dread Pirate Roberts during the later, more legally consequential period of the site's operation, including during the time of the alleged murder for hire communications, may not have actually been Ross himself. According to this defense theory, Ross had been lured back into the operation later on, essentially framed or manipulated into becoming what prosecutors described as the perfect, easily identifiable scapegoat, someone whose earlier, less guarded involvement in the site's founding made him a convenient target for whoever had actually continued running the more dangerous, more legally exposed later chapters of the Silk Road's existence. This was, without question, an ambitious legal strategy, one that required the jury to accept a fairly complex alternative narrative, essentially asking them to believe that Ross had founded a groundbreaking anonymous marketplace, then walked away from it at some point, only for someone else to seamlessly step into his exact digital identity, his exact writing style, his exact philosophical worldview, without ever being detected or identified by investigators, users, or fellow administrators throughout this transition. The prosecution, led by Assistant United States attorneys including Sarah Turner, approached the case with what many courtroom observers described as an overwhelming, meticulously organized presentation of evidence, one designed specifically to leave little room for the kind of alternative narrative the defense was attempting to construct. At the center of the prosecution's case sat something extraordinarily rare in criminal proceedings. Ross's own personal journal, discovered on devices seized during his arrest, containing years of detailed first-person reflections chronicling the entire evolution of his thinking, from his early philosophical inspiration drawn from Austrian economics through the technical development of the Silk Road and continuing through years of operational decisions made as Dread Pirate Roberts. Prosecutors read extended passages from this journal aloud in court, passages in which Ross described, in his own words, his motivations for creating the marketplace, his excitement as it grew in popularity and profitability, and his ongoing, continuous involvement in its operation over a period of years, directly contradicting the defense's narrative of an early founder who had subsequently disengaged from the project. Alongside the journal, prosecutors presented an enormous volume of digital chat logs, private messages exchanged between Dread Pirate Roberts and various Silk Road administrators, sellers, and other associates, messages that demonstrated detailed, ongoing, hands-on management of the platform's daily operations across the entire span of its existence. These logs included discussions of site policy decisions, technical troubleshooting, financial management of Bitcoin holdings, and notably, the disturbing communications related to the murder for hire allegations explored in Chapter 7, though these specific allegations remained legally separate from the core charges being tried in this particular New York courtroom. Financial records presented during the trial proved similarly damning for the defense's argument. Prosecutors traced the flow of Bitcoin commissions collected by the Silk Road directly to wallets under Ross's personal control, demonstrating a clear, unbroken financial relationship between Ross Ulbricht and the platform's earnings across the entire period in question, precisely the period during which the defense claimed he had allegedly stepped away from operational control. And had taken together, this body of evidence created what many legal observers described as an unusually strong, comprehensive prosecution case. one built not primarily on circumstantial inference, but on Ross's own personal writings, his own private communications, and direct financial records tracing money into his own accounts. But beyond the purely legal and evidentiary dimensions of the trial, something more profound, more philosophically significant, was unfolding inside that Manhattan courtroom, and it centered on testimony that had little to do with encryption protocols or Bitcoin wallets and everything to do with human suffering. Krekek. Throughout the trial, prosecutors called forward witnesses whose lives had been directly, tragically affected by drugs purchased through the Silk Road marketplace. Among the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire proceeding came from family members who testified about loved ones, often young people, who had died from overdoses involving substances purchased anonymously through the platform Ross had built. These testimonies painted a starkly different picture than the abstract, philosophical framing Ross himself had used throughout his personal journal entries to describe his creation, where Ross had written about economic experiments, about voluntary exchange, about a marketplace free from government coercion. Grieving parents described something entirely different. Sons and daughters who had died alone, often unexpectedly, after purchasing drugs of uncertain purity and potency from anonymous sellers. Transactions made possible specifically because the Silk Road had removed the traditional friction, and in some cases the traditional caution, associated with obtaining illegal substances through more conventional, higher-risk channels. This juxtaposition between Ross's own idealistic philosophical self-description and the raw, devastating human testimony presented by grieving families formed the emotional core of the entire trial, and it forced the courtroom to confront one of the deepest, most difficult questions raised throughout this entire story. Is it possible to build a system explicitly designed around principles of individual liberty and voluntary exchange and still bear genuine moral and legal responsibility for the real-world harm that system ultimately facilitates? Ross's underlying philosophical argument, rooted in the Austrian economic tradition explored back in Chapter 1, held that responsible adults should have the right to make their own choices about what substances they consume, and that any resulting harm was ultimately a matter of individual responsibility, not something the platform itself or its creator should be held legally or morally accountable for. But the prosecution and the grieving families who testified presented a fundamentally different moral framework, one that emphasized the real, tangible, often devastating consequences that flowed directly from decisions Ross had made, consequences that extended far beyond abstract philosophical principles about individual liberty into the concrete reality of families permanently shattered by the loss of a child, a sibling, a parent. This tension between abstract philosophical ideals about personal freedom and concrete, undeniable social consequences represents one of the most enduring, unresolved debates connected to this entire case, one that extends well beyond the specific facts of Ross Ulbricht's individual actions, touching on much broader, ongoing societal debates about drug policy, personal liberty, and the appropriate boundaries of government regulation. Debates that remain deeply contested to this very day, without any clear consensus in sight. After weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and closing arguments from both sides, the case went to the jury. Deliberations proceeded relatively quickly given the scale and complexity of the evidence presented. In February of 2015, the jury returned its verdict, guilty, on all 7 counts brought against him, including narcotics trafficking by means of the internet, conspiracy to commit narcotics trafficking, continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to commit computer hacking, conspiracy to traffic in fraudulent identity documents, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The continuing criminal enterprise charge, sometimes informally referred to as the Kingpin statute, carried particular legal significance as it is typically reserved for individuals found to have organized, supervised, and profited from a large-scale, ongoing criminal operation, and carries some of the most severe potential penalties available under federal law, including the possibility of a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years, with a maximum sentence extending all the way to life imprisonment. The sentencing hearing itself, which took place several months later in May of 2015, became, in many respects, an even more emotionally charged proceeding than the trial that had preceded it. Ross addressed the court directly before his sentence was handed down, expressing what he described as genuine remorse, acknowledging the pain his actions had caused, and asking the judge for leniency, describing the Silk Road in retrospect as the biggest mistake of his life, a naive and, in his own words, deeply harmful idealistic experiment that had spiraled far beyond anything he had originally intended or anticipated. But the presiding judge, Catherine Forrest, delivered a sentence that sent shockwaves throughout the courtroom and would go on to generate extensive debate and controversy for years to come, extending well beyond the immediate circle of those directly involved in the case. Judge Forrest sentenced Ross Ulbricht to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole on the continuing criminal enterprise charge alone, and imposed additional concurrent sentences on the remaining counts, including a combined sentence of 40 years across two of the other charges, effectively ensuring that, barring some future legal intervention, Ross would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. In her remarks, severity of this sentence, Judge Forrest specifically addressed what she described as the need to send an unmistakable message, both to Ross himself and to anyone who might consider building a similar platform in the future, emphasizing the scale of harm facilitated by the Silk Road, and rejecting the defense's characterization of the crime as fundamentally nonviolent or victimless, pointing directly to the overdose deaths connected to substances purchased through the platform, as well as the deeply disturbing, if not formally prosecuted, murder for hire allegations explored earlier in this series. The sentence, life without the possibility of parole, represented one of the harshest punishments ever handed down in the United States for a nonviolent drug-related offense, and it immediately ignited fierce, deeply polarized public debate that continues in many respects to this very day. For many observers, particularly within legal and civil liberties communities, the sentence appeared strikingly disproportionate when compared with typical sentences handed down for even large-scale, traditional drug trafficking operations, many of which, even when involving significant violence, rarely result in a full life sentence without any possibility of parole. Critics argued that Ross, whatever his moral culpability, had been convicted primarily of facilitating drug transactions through a website, a fundamentally different category of crime than direct hands-on drug distribution or violent criminal activity, and that the murder for hire allegations, however disturbing, had never actually been proven in a court of law, and therefore should not have factored so heavily into a sentence for charges that were, on their face, nonviolent in nature. This sentiment gave rise to a dedicated advocacy movement, which we'll explore in greater detail later in this series, campaigning for Ross's eventual release, arguing that his sentence represented a fundamental miscarriage of proportional justice, regardless of one's views on the underlying morality or legality of the Silk Road itself. On the other side of this debate, supporters of the sentence, including many within law enforcement and drug policy circles, argued that the sheer scale of harm facilitated by the Silk Road, a marketplace that had processed well over $1 billion in illegal drug transactions, contributing directly to documented overdose deaths, alongside credible evidence suggesting a willingness to order violence in order to protect the operation, fully justified the severity of the sentence handed down, regardless of the technically nonviolent nature of the specific charges Ross had ultimately been convicted on. This fundamental disagreement about proportionality, about how the justice system should weigh abstract philosophical intentions against concrete, real-world consequences, about how heavily uncharged, contested allegations should factor into sentencing for separate, formally proven crimes, remains, to this day, one of the most actively debated aspects of the entire Silk Road saga, discussed extensively within legal academic circles, criminal justice reform movements, and broader public discourse surrounding drug policy in the United States. But regardless of where any individual observer ultimately falls on these deeply contested questions, one fact remained undeniable in the immediate aftermath of the sentencing hearing. The story of Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road had transcended the boundaries of a typical criminal case. it had become something closer to a genuine cultural phenomenon, a story that forced ordinary people around the world to grapple, often for the very first time, with complicated questions about technology, anonymity, government authority, personal liberty, and the true cost of idealism taken to its most extreme, unchecked conclusions. And remarkably, even as Ross began serving what appeared to be an unconditional life sentence, the story of the Silk Road itself, the marketplace, the underlying technology, and the broader movement it had inadvertently helped inspire was far from finished. In the months and years following Ross's conviction and sentencing, an entirely new chapter of this saga would begin to unfold, one involving a wave of successor marketplaces, each attempting to replicate and, in some cases, improve upon the model Ross had originally pioneered, learning directly from the specific mistakes that had ultimately led to his downfall, while facing an increasingly sophisticated, increasingly experienced federal law enforcement apparatus that had, through years of painstaking investigation, developed an entirely new playbook for pursuing this emerging category of anonymous digital crime. Chapter 10: Children of the Silk Road, the Legacy of a Fallen Empire. When federal agents shut down the Silk Road in October of 2013, many observers, including some within law enforcement itself, believed they had dealt a fatal blow to the entire concept of anonymous online drug marketplaces. The theory seemed reasonable enough on the surface. The pioneer had been caught. The mythology surrounding Dread Pirate Roberts had been shattered, replaced by the far less glamorous image of a young man facing life in federal prison. Surely, the thinking went, this dramatic, highly publicized takedown would serve as enough of a deterrent to prevent anyone else from attempting something similar. That assumption turned out to be almost entirely wrong. Within a matter of weeks of the original Silk Road's shutdown, a new marketplace appeared on the Tor network, calling itself, with almost defiant simplicity, Silk Road 2.0. This successor site was built by former administrators and community members from the original platform, individuals who had absorbed years of firsthand knowledge about how the marketplace had operated, what security measures had worked, and, crucially, what specific mistakes had ultimately led to Ross Ulbricht's downfall. The rapid emergence of this successor site revealed something important about the underlying dynamics driving this entire phenomenon, something that would repeat itself again and again in the years that followed. The Silk Road hadn't simply been one man's isolated criminal creation. It had demonstrated conclusively and publicly that a genuine, sustainable market existed for exactly this kind of anonymous online commerce. Thousands of buyers had grown accustomed to the convenience, the relative safety, and the anonymity of purchasing drugs through an online marketplace rather than through traditional, often more dangerous street-level transactions. That demand didn't simply evaporate the moment the original platform disappeared. It immediately began searching for a new place to go. Silk Road 2.0 managed to attract a substantial user base relatively quickly, rebuilding much of the infrastructure and reputation systems that had made the original platform successful. But its operators, despite their firsthand knowledge of what had gone wrong before, ultimately fell victim to many of the same fundamental vulnerabilities. In November of 2014, just over a year after its launch, law enforcement agencies, through a large-scale, internationally coordinated operation, seized the site and arrested its alleged operator, a young man who had taken on the pseudonym DEFCON, Dez. This pattern, a marketplace rising, growing, attracting law enforcement attention, and eventually collapsing, only to be immediately replaced more sophisticated successor, would go on to define the entire subsequent history of dark web drug marketplaces throughout the remainder of the 2010s. Perhaps the most significant of these successor platforms was a marketplace called Alphabay, which launched in late 2014 and grew over the following several years into something even larger and more sophisticated than the original Silk Road had ever been. At its peak, Alphabay reportedly hosted hundreds of thousands of individual product listings, vastly exceeding the scale the original Silk Road had ever reached, and processed transactions estimated to be worth well over $1 billion over the course of its operation. Alphabay's operators had clearly studied the mistakes of their predecessors with considerable care. The platform implemented more sophisticated security protocols, more rigorous operational compartmentalization, and expanded well beyond drugs alone, hosting listings for stolen financial data, counterfeit documents, and a wide range of other illegal goods and services, transforming what had begun as a relatively narrow drug marketplace concept into something closer to a comprehensive full-service criminal commerce platform. And yet, despite these more sophisticated precautions, Alphabet ultimately met a fate remarkably similar to its predecessors. In July of 2017, following an extensive internationally coordinated investigation involving law enforcement agencies from the United States, Thailand, and several other countries, Alphabet was seized and shut down, and its alleged operator, a young Canadian man, was arrested in Thailand. Remarkably, the specific mistake that ultimately led investigators to identify Alphabet's operator bore a striking, almost eerie resemblance to the mistake that had originally exposed Ross Ulbricht years earlier. Investigators discovered that the site's operator had used a personal email address, one that could be traced back to his real identity, in an early promotional message posted years before the platform had grown into a major criminal enterprise, echoing almost precisely the Altoid forum post that had originally unraveled the Silk Road. This repetition reveals something genuinely important about the psychology underlying these cases, a pattern that extends well beyond any single individual involved. Even among criminals who are fully aware of previous cases, who have studied exactly how earlier operators were caught, the same fundamental vulnerability tends to reappear. Mistakes made in the earliest, most casual, least guarded days of a project, before its creator fully grasps the scale of scrutiny that success will eventually invite. Around the same time, Alphabet was being dismantled. Law enforcement agencies executed a coordinated takedown of another major successor marketplace, a platform called Hansa Market, which had grown to become one of the largest remaining dark web marketplaces following Alphabet's collapse. In a particularly notable strategic move, Dutch law enforcement agencies, working in coordination with international partners, had actually secretly taken covert control of Hansa Market's servers weeks before publicly announcing its shutdown, quietly monitoring transactions and collecting evidence on thousands of users during this period before ultimately revealing the operation and shutting the site down entirely. This coordinated simultaneous takedown of both Alphabet and Hansa Market, executed deliberately within a narrow window of each other, represented a significant strategic evolution in how international law enforcement agencies approach these cases. By timing the shutdowns closely together, investigators specifically aimed to prevent users from simply migrating en masse from one collapsing marketplace directly to another, a pattern that had allowed previous successor sites to rapidly absorb displaced users following earlier takedowns. But even this more sophisticated, coordinated approach ultimately proved unable to permanently eliminate the underlying phenomenon. In the years that followed, additional marketplaces continued to emerge, each attempting to learn from the specific mistakes of their predecessors, implementing increasingly sophisticated security measures, more decentralized organizational structures designed to reduce the impact of any single arrest, and in some cases, increasingly complex cryptocurrency laundering techniques specifically designed to counter the growing analytical capabilities being developed by law enforcement agencies. This ongoing pattern reveals what might be described as a genuinely dangerous, self-perpetuating cycle, one worth examining carefully because it speaks to broader, more fundamental truths about the relationship between anonymity, technology, and criminal enterprise. Each time a major dark web marketplace is successfully shut down and its operators arrested, that very success generates an unintended consequence, an enormous amount of publicly available information about exactly what mistakes led to the platform's downfall. Court documents, investigative journalism, and in some cases, detailed technical analysis published by law enforcement agencies themselves effectively create a kind of after-action report, one that subsequent, more careful operators can study closely in order to avoid repeating the same specific errors. This means that in a very real, measurable sense, each successive generation of dark web marketplace tends to become somewhat more sophisticated, more resistant to the specific investigative techniques that brought down its predecessors than the one that came before it. It's an arms race in the truest sense of that phrase, one where each side continuously adapts in direct response to the specific tactics and mistakes revealed by the previous round of conflict. On the law enforcement side of this equation, agencies have similarly had to continuously evolve their own capabilities in direct response. The relatively rudimentary digital forensics techniques that eventually unmasked Ross Ulbricht, primarily built around old-fashioned pattern matching and forum post archaeology, gradually gave way to far more sophisticated blockchain analysis capabilities, specialized software tools designed specifically to trace the flow of cryptocurrency transactions across the blockchain, even when criminals attempted to obscure that trail using increasingly complex laundering techniques. This brings us to a critical and genuinely fascinating dimension of this entire ongoing story, one directly connected to the themes we explored back in Chapter 3. The role Bitcoin itself has played throughout this continuing saga, and the deeply contested, ongoing debates surrounding its relationship to criminal activity. In the years following the original Silk Road's collapse, Bitcoin's public reputation underwent a genuinely fascinating transformation. In its earliest years, the currency had been closely and almost inseparably associated in the public imagination with exactly the kind of criminal activity explored throughout this series, an association reinforced repeatedly by extensive media coverage of the original Silk Road case, and later by coverage of successor marketplaces like Alpha Bay and Hansa Market. But as blockchain analysis capabilities developed by both private companies and law enforcement agencies grew increasingly sophisticated, an important, somewhat counterintuitive reality began to emerge. Bitcoin, contrary to popular early assumptions, is not actually truly anonymous, at least not in the way many early adopters, including apparently Ross Ulbricht himself, originally believed it to be. Remember from our earlier discussion of blockchain technology that every single Bitcoin transaction is permanently publicly recorded on that shared decentralized ledger we described back in Chapter 3. While the identities behind individual wallet addresses aren't automatically immediately visible, sophisticated analytical techniques developed extensively over the years, specifically in response to cases like the Silk Road, have proven remarkably effective at tracing the flow of funds across that public ledger, and in many cases eventually connecting specific transactions back to real-world identities, particularly at the crucial moments when cryptocurrency is converted into traditional currency through exchanges that are legally required to verify their users' identities. This reality has led many experts in the field to describe Bitcoin, somewhat counterintuitively, as pseudonymous rather than truly anonymous, a distinction that has proven enormously consequential for the ongoing history of dark web marketplaces, and one that has ironically made cryptocurrency, in certain respects, a less perfect tool for criminal activity than many early adopters, including Ross himself, originally assumed it would be. This growing sophistication in blockchain analysis capabilities represents one of the most significant lasting legacies of the entire Silk Road saga. Federal agencies, having been caught genuinely flat-footed by the sheer novelty of the original case, invested enormous resources in subsequent years developing dedicated cryptocurrency investigation units, entirely new categories of specialized law enforcement expertise that simply hadn't existed in any meaningful developed form prior to the Silk Road's emergence. Private companies emerged as well, specializing exclusively in blockchain forensics and analysis, working closely with law enforcement agencies around the world to help trace illicit cryptocurrency transactions across an increasingly complex, increasingly global financial ecosystem. This entire specialized industry, now worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually, can trace its origins directly back to the investigative challenges first encountered during the original pursuit of Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road. So what ultimately is the broader lesson we should draw from this entire cycle of rise, collapse, and rebirth that has defined the world of dark web marketplaces in the years following the original Silk Road's downfall? Perhaps the most important, most enduring lesson is this: anonymity-enabling technology, whether we're discussing the Tor network, cryptocurrency, or encrypted communications more broadly, represents a genuine, unavoidable double-edged sword, one that simply cannot be permanently, completely eliminated from the world, regardless of how many individual marketplaces or operators are successfully identified and prosecuted. These technologies were never inherently designed for criminal purposes. We explored this reality extensively back in Chapter 2, when discussing the origins of Tor as a tool specifically developed to protect legitimate intelligence operations, and later to protect journalists, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens living under oppressive governments around the world. That legitimate, genuinely valuable purpose hasn't disappeared, even as these same tools have simultaneously enabled billions of dollars in illegal drug transactions across successive generations of dark web marketplaces. This fundamental tension between the legitimate value of privacy-enabling technology and its potential for criminal misuse represents one of the defining, unresolved technological and philosophical challenges of our modern digital age, one that extends well beyond the specific individual story of Ross Ulbricht and the original Silk Road into much broader, ongoing debates about encryption, digital privacy, and the appropriate boundaries of government surveillance in an increasingly interconnected world. And remarkably, woven throughout this entire complex, ongoing saga, sits Bitcoin itself, a currency whose fate became permanently, inextricably intertwined with this story from its very earliest days. As we've explored throughout this chapter, Bitcoin's association with criminal marketplaces like the Silk Road significantly shaped, for better and for worse, its early public reputation and broader cultural perception. But that relationship, as we'll explore in even greater detail in the next chapter, would eventually take an extraordinary, almost unbelievable turn, one involving the specific enormous quantity of Bitcoin seized directly from Ross Ulbricht himself, Bitcoin that the United States government would come to hold for years following his arrest, watching its value transform in ways that no one involved in this entire saga could have possibly anticipated back in that quiet corner of the Glen Park Public Library on that ordinary October afternoon in 2013. Chapter 11, From Crime to Global Finance, The Paradox of the Seized Bitcoin. There is a strange, almost poetic irony sitting at the very center of this entire story, one that becomes clearer with each passing year. The United States government, the same institution that spent years hunting down Ross Ulbricht specifically because of his role in building an anonymous, government-defying marketplace, would eventually become one of the largest single holders of Bitcoin anywhere on the planet, entirely because of that very same criminal enterprise. To understand how this happened, we need to return to the moment of Ross's arrest inside the Glen Park Library, and specifically to what investigators found once they gained access to his seized laptop. As we discussed in Chapter 8, the laptop agents grabbed that afternoon was open, unlocked, and actively logged into the Silk Road's administrative systems. But beyond simply providing proof of Ross's role as Dread Pirate Roberts, that laptop also contains something else, something that would take on extraordinary significance in the years that followed. Access to digital wallets holding a substantial quantity of Bitcoin, cryptocurrency that Ross had personally accumulated over nearly 3 years of collecting commissions from Silk Road transactions. In the immediate aftermath of the arrest, federal authorities seized tens of thousands of individual Bitcoin from these wallets, along with additional Bitcoin recovered through subsequent investigations into related accounts and infrastructure. At the time, valued using the exchange rates of late 2013, this seizure was already considered enormous, worth somewhere in the range of tens of millions of dollars, making it, by a considerable margin, one of the largest cryptocurrency seizures law enforcement had ever conducted up to that point. But here is where the story takes its truly remarkable turn, one that reveals just how unpredictable and in many ways unprecedented this entire new financial frontier would prove to be. Bitcoin in late 2013 was still an almost bewilderingly volatile, poorly understood asset even among many financial professionals. Its price had already climbed substantially from the fractions of a cent it had traded for back when Ross first began building the Silk Road. But it remained, by any conventional financial standard, a wildly speculative, largely unproven technology. dismissed by many mainstream economists and financial institutions as a passing curiosity, or worse, a dangerous bubble destined to eventually collapse to nothing. Federal authorities holding this enormous seized cache of Bitcoin faced genuinely difficult, largely unprecedented decisions about exactly what to do with it. Unlike seized cash or seized physical assets like real estate or vehicles, there was no long established legal or procedural framework in place for how a government agency should manage, store, and eventually dispose of a massive holding of this strange, entirely new form of digital property. Over the following years, the United States government proceeded, in stages, to sell off significant portions of this seized Bitcoin through a series of public auctions, primarily managed by the United States Marshals Service, the federal agency responsible for handling and disposing of assets seized through criminal forfeiture proceedings. The very first of these auctions, held in the summer of 2014, attracted attention from an unexpected and, in many respects, quite fitting bidder, venture capitalist Tim Draper, a prominent, well-known figure within Silicon Valley's technology investment community, who successfully purchased a substantial portion of the auctioned Bitcoin, an enormous quantity that at the time was valued in the tens of millions of dollars. What makes this particular transaction so remarkable in hindsight is simply what happened to the value of that Bitcoin in the years that followed. Bitcoin's price, which had been trading in the range of a few $100s per coin at the time of this early auction, would go on over the subsequent decade to experience a series of truly extraordinary price surges, eventually climbing to levels that would have seemed almost fantastical to anyone observing the market back in 2014. By various points throughout the following 10 years, Bitcoin's price would climb into the tens of thousands of dollars per individual coin, at times even exceeding $100,000 per coin during periods of particularly intense market enthusiasm. This meant that the specific batch of Bitcoin purchased through that early government auction, worth tens of millions of dollars at the time of purchase, would, at various later points, have theoretically been worth many hundreds of millions of dollars, an almost unimaginable rate of appreciation for what had, until only recently, been dismissed by much of the financial establishment as a fringe, largely worthless technological experiment. But Draper's early purchase represented only a portion of the total Bitcoin ultimately connected to Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road case. Federal authorities continued discovering and seizing additional Bitcoin holdings connected to the case for years following the original arrest through a series of separate subsequent investigations. One particularly remarkable development occurred in November of 2020, when federal investigators announced the seizure of an additional enormous cache of Bitcoin, one that had remained hidden, unclaimed, and largely untouched for years, discovered through sophisticated blockchain analysis techniques that, as we discussed in the previous chapter, simply hadn't existed in their current, highly developed form back when Ross was originally arrested. So, this particular seizure involving Bitcoin that had apparently been hidden by Ross himself in wallets separate from those discovered during his original arrest was valued at the time it was announced at well over $1 billion based on Bitcoin's price at that specific moment. This single seizure alone represented one of the largest cryptocurrency forfeitures in the entire history of American law enforcement. And it meant that, when combined with previous seizures and subsequent Bitcoin price appreciation, the total value connected to the original Silk Road case had grown into an almost unfathomable sum, one that dwarfed even the already enormous figures involved in the original investigation back in 2013. Let's sit with the genuine strangeness of this situation for a moment, because it represents one of the most quietly remarkable financial stories connected to the entire cryptocurrency industry's early history. The United States government, an institution whose entire early relationship with Bitcoin had been defined by its role in prosecuting one of the largest criminal marketplaces the currency had ever been associated with, gradually found itself holding and periodically selling Bitcoin worth an amount of money that placed it among the largest individual holders of the cryptocurrency anywhere in the entire world. This created a genuinely unusual dynamic within the broader cryptocurrency industry, one that continues to generate discussion and analysis to this day. Major government auctions of seized Bitcoin, given the sheer scale of the holdings involved, have, at various points, had a noticeable, measurable impact on Bitcoin's broader market price, with large-scale government sales sometimes coinciding with temporary downward pressure on prices, simply due to the sudden increase in available supply entering the broader market all at once. This reality has led to ongoing debate among financial analysts and cryptocurrency industry observers about the broader role government-held cryptocurrency should play within financial markets. Light debates that touch on complex questions about market manipulation, government transparency, and the appropriate handling of seized digital assets. Questions that remain, in many respects, still actively unresolved even today. But perhaps the most philosophically fascinating dimension of this entire situation involves a deeper, more academic question, one that scholars, economists, and cryptocurrency historians continue to actively debate. Did the Silk Road, despite being an undeniably illegal criminal enterprise, inadvertently play a genuinely significant role in helping legitimize Bitcoin in the eyes of the broader public and, eventually, mainstream financial institutions? This is a genuinely uncomfortable question to sit with, precisely because it forces us to consider whether something built entirely around criminal activity could have simultaneously produced meaningful, positive, unintended consequences for a broader technological ecosystem. Consider the sequence of events we've traced throughout this series so far. Back in Chapter 3, we explored how Bitcoin in its earliest years existed as an obscure, largely unknown technology, understood and used by only a small, niche community of cryptography enthusiasts and libertarian-minded technologists. The Silk Road, through its adoption of Bitcoin as its exclusive currency, inadvertently exposed thousands of ordinary internet users to the concept of cryptocurrency for the very first time, forcing many of them to learn out of simple necessity how digital wallets worked, how to acquire and securely store Bitcoin, and how blockchain-based transactions functioned at a basic conceptual level. So while this early exposure was certainly not the kind of legitimate, above-board introduction to cryptocurrency that the industry's most enthusiastic advocates might have preferred, it nonetheless contributed in a very real, measurable sense to broader public awareness of Bitcoin during its critical, formative early years. Years during which the currency desperately needed this kind of expanding user base in order to develop into anything resembling a genuinely functional, widely adopted financial technology. Additionally, the extensive media coverage generated by the original Silk Road case and by Ross Ulbricht's subsequent highly publicized arrest and trial, while certainly framing Bitcoin initially in a predominantly negative light, closely associated with criminal activity, also had the secondary effect of introducing the concept of cryptocurrency to an enormous global audience that might not have otherwise encountered it for years or perhaps even decades to come. In the years following Ross's arrest and conviction, as blockchain analysis techniques grew increasingly sophisticated, and as law enforcement agencies around the world developed genuine expertise in tracing cryptocurrency transactions, Bitcoin's reputation began undergoing the kind of gradual transformation we touched on briefly in the previous chapter. Rather than remaining permanently associated primarily with criminal marketplaces and illicit transactions, Bitcoin increasingly came to be understood by mainstream financial institutions and eventually by many governments around the world as a legitimate, if still relatively novel and volatile, financial asset class in its own right. Major financial institutions, corporations, and even some national governments would go on in the years following the Silk Road case to begin holding, trading, and in some instances directly investing in Bitcoin and related cryptocurrency technologies, a level of mainstream financial acceptance that would have seemed almost unimaginable back in the earliest days of the Silk Road, when Bitcoin traded for mere fractions of a single dollar and was dismissed by most conventional financial analysts as a fringe technological curiosity, as destined for eventual obscurity. This transformation forces us to confront a genuinely complex, morally uncomfortable truth about the relationship between technology and human behavior, one that echoes directly back to the broader themes we've explored throughout this entire series. The technology itself, whether we're discussing Bitcoin, the Tor network, or encryption more broadly, remains fundamentally neutral in a strictly technical sense. It does not inherently possess moral character, good or evil. It simply provides a set of capabilities that can be applied toward genuinely harmful, destructive purposes, as Ross Ulbricht ultimately demonstrated through the Silk Road, or toward legitimate, productive, even beneficial purposes, as Bitcoin's gradual, complicated evolution into a broadly recognized financial asset would eventually illustrate. It is human beings operating with specific intentions, specific ideologies, and specific decisions made under specific circumstances who ultimately determine how any given technology gets applied and what consequences, both intended and unintended, ultimately flow from those applications. Ross Ulbricht, driven by his particular blend of libertarian idealism and eventually, according to serious allegations explored earlier in this series, a willingness to resort to genuinely troubling extremes in order to protect his creation, chose to apply these powerful anonymity enabling technologies toward building a massive illegal drug marketplace. That specific set of choices produced real, undeniable harm, reflected in the overdose deaths described during his trial, in the disturbing allegations of violence explored in Chapter 7, and in the fundamentally corrosive effect his marketplace had on broader trust in legitimate applications of privacy-enabling technology. And yet, almost entirely independent of Ross's own intentions or personal culpability, the broader technological and financial ecosystem surrounding Bitcoin continued evolving in directions that ultimately proved far more constructive, far more broadly beneficial than anything Ross himself had specifically intended or anticipated back when he first began exploring cryptocurrency as a tool for his anonymous marketplace and dismingity. This duality, this genuinely uncomfortable coexistence of undeniable harm alongside unintended broader technological benefit, represents one of the most philosophically complex, enduringly fascinating dimensions of this entire saga, one that resists easy, comfortable resolution, and instead demands the kind of nuanced, careful thinking this series has attempted to bring to every chapter of Ross Ulbricht's extraordinary, deeply troubling story. But even as this broader technological and financial legacy continued unfolding throughout the years following his arrest, a much more immediate, much more personal question remained unresolved for Ross Ulbricht himself, sitting in federal prison, serving what had been handed down as an unconditional life sentence without any possibility of parole. Would the man once known throughout the internet's darkest corners as Dread Pirate Roberts remain in prison for the entire remainder of his natural life, exactly as Judge Catherine Forrest had ordered back in 2015? Or would the passage of time, the evolution of public opinion, and the tireless efforts of a dedicated advocacy movement eventually combine to produce a genuinely unexpected final chapter in this remarkable, deeply complicated story? Chapter 12, Freedom or Punishment, the final reckoning and the questions left unanswered for years. Following the sentencing hearing described in Chapter 9, Ross Ulbricht remained in federal custody, serving what had been handed down as an unconditional life sentence without any possibility of parole. But outside the walls of the various federal facilities where he was held, eventually including a facility in Arizona, a determined, increasingly organized movement was quietly, steadily building momentum on his behalf. This movement, known widely as the Free Ross Campaign, drew support from a genuinely diverse, sometimes unexpected coalition of voices. Libertarian activists who had long viewed Ross's underlying philosophical motivations as fundamentally sympathetic, even if they disagreed with the specific methods he ultimately chose, formed the earliest and most consistent backbone of this advocacy effort. Criminal justice reform organizations, concerned broadly with what they viewed as excessive, disproportionate sentencing for nonviolent offenses within the American legal system, joined this cause as well, often citing Ross's case as a particularly striking example of a life sentence handed down for a crime that on its face involved no direct physical violence. Perhaps most significantly, as the cryptocurrency industry itself grew over the following decade from a fringe technological curiosity into a genuinely massive mainstream financial sector, Ross increasingly came to be viewed within certain corners of that industry as something close to a founding martyred figure. Many early Bitcoin adopters and cryptocurrency entrepreneurs pointed specifically to the role the Silk Road had played, as we explored in the previous chapter, in helping expose Bitcoin to its earliest wave of mainstream users, arguing that Ross, whatever his legal culpability, deserved recognition as a genuine pioneer of the technology, someone whose punishment had grown increasingly difficult to justify as cryptocurrency itself became an accepted, legitimate part of the global financial system. Ross himself, throughout his years in prison, continued to reflect publicly on his case, primarily through letters and statements shared by his family and supporters. These writings revealed a man who, while expressing genuine remorse for the specific, tangible harms connected to the Silk Road, particularly the overdose deaths described during his trial, continued to grapple in a deeply personal, evolving way with the underlying philosophical questions that had originally motivated him back in his university years in Texas. He wrote about the painful gap between the idealistic vision he had originally set out to build and the far more complicated, often devastating reality that vision had ultimately produced, describing his younger self as naive, in many respects, about the true human consequences of removing all friction, all oversight, from a marketplace this consequential. For over a decade, despite this growing advocacy movement, and despite multiple unsuccessful appeals working their way through the federal court system, including efforts that reached both a federal court of appeals and, eventually, the United States Supreme Court, Ross's life sentence remained firmly, unchangingly in place. Senge Best by most conventional legal measures, his case appeared to be settled, a lengthy, thoroughly litigated matter with no realistic remaining path toward release. And then in January of 2025, something genuinely unexpected happened, something that would add an entirely new, remarkably dramatic final chapter to this already extraordinary story. On the day after his second presidential inauguration, President Donald Trump announced through a public statement that he had granted Ross Ulbricht a full and unconditional pardon. This decision fulfilled a specific promise Trump had made repeatedly throughout his presidential campaign, a promise made directly to libertarian voters and to an increasingly influential, well-organized cryptocurrency industry, both constituencies that had, over the preceding years, become significant vocal supporters of the broader Free Ross movement. In his public remarks announcing the decision, Trump described the original life sentence handed down by Judge Forrest as excessive and characterized Ross as someone who had already served a substantial, meaningful period of incarceration for what he described as fundamentally nonviolent offenses. The pardon was immediate and complete, effectively ending in a single stroke more than a decade of imprisonment that had begun, as we explored extensively throughout this series, inside a quiet corner of the Glen Park Public Library back in October of 2013. The reaction to this pardon was, predictably, given everything we've explored throughout this entire series, sharply, deeply divided. Supporters of the decision, including many within the Free Ross movement, celebrated it as long overdue justice. A genuine correction of what they had argued for years was a fundamentally disproportionate sentence, one that had kept Ross imprisoned for over a decade for a series of crimes that, whatever their broader social consequences, had not resulted in a specific, formally proven act of direct violence. Critics of the pardon, however, expressed genuine alarm, and in some cases outright anger, at the decision. Several members of Congress publicly voiced concerns, pointing directly to the substantiated overdose deaths connected to substances purchased through the Silk Road platform, deaths that prosecutors had specifically presented as evidence during the original trial. Critics also pointed to the deeply disturbing murder-for-hire allegations explored in detail back in Chapter 7, arguing that even though those specific allegations had never resulted in a formal criminal conviction, the underlying chat logs presented during earlier legal proceedings raised serious, unresolved questions about Ross's willingness to resort to genuine, potentially lethal violence in order to protect his criminal enterprise. Some observers also raised broader questions about the political context surrounding the decision itself, noting the substantial financial support the cryptocurrency industry had provided to Trump's presidential campaign, um, and questioning whether that industry support may have played a meaningful role in the ultimate decision to grant clemency to a figure so closely, symbolically associated with Bitcoin's contested early history. Regardless of where any individual observer ultimately falls on these genuinely difficult, deeply contested questions, this remarkable final development forces us to confront, one final time, the central philosophical tension that has run throughout this entire 12-chapter journey, from the very first pages of Ross Ulbricht's story, back in a comfortable childhood home in Austin, Texas, all the way through this extraordinary, largely unforeseeable conclusion, where exactly should a just, functioning society draw the line between protecting individual liberty and enforcing collective moral responsibility for the downstream consequences of that liberty? Ross's original philosophical framework, rooted deeply in the Austrian economic tradition explored back in Chapter 1, held that adults possess an inherent right to make their own choices, free from government coercion, and that the resulting consequences of those choices, including potentially serious consequences like drug addiction or overdose, ultimately belong to the individuals making them, not to whoever happened to build the marketplace or platform that facilitated the underlying transaction. But the grieving families who testified during Ross's trial and the broader legal system that ultimately convicted and sentenced him operated from a fundamentally different moral framework, one that holds creators and facilitators genuinely, directly accountable for the foreseeable, real world harm that flows from the systems they deliberately choose to build, regardless of how carefully those systems might be wrapped in abstract philosophical justification. This tension between radical individual liberty and collective social responsibility extends, of course, far beyond the specific individual facts of Ross Ulbricht's case. It touches on some of the most enduring, unresolved debates running throughout the entire history of political philosophy. Debates about the proper role and limits of government, about the boundaries of personal freedom, and about who ultimately bears responsibility when powerful new tools and technologies are deliberately designed to remove traditional forms of oversight and accountability from human behavior. As we bring this journey to its conclusion, it's worth taking a moment to look back across the full arc of everything we've explored together throughout this series. We began with a curious, intellectually restless boy growing up in Texas, drawn toward physics for its elegant, discoverable order, and later toward economics for its promise of a similarly elegant, principled framework for understanding human society. We watched that intellectual curiosity gradually transform into genuine ideological conviction as Ross absorbed the philosophical traditions of Austrian economics and libertarian thought, developing a deeply held belief that government interference in voluntary human exchange represented a fundamental moral wrong. We traced how that conviction, combined with two remarkable independently developed technologies, the Tor network, originally built to protect government intelligence operations, and Bitcoin, born from the ashes of a devastating global financial crisis, provided Ross with exactly the tools he needed to transform his abstract philosophical vision into a genuine, functioning reality. We watched that reality grow from a single modest transaction involving a small bag of psilocybin mushrooms into a sprawling billion-dollar criminal enterprise, one that fundamentally challenged how law enforcement agencies around the world understood and pursued anonymous digital crime. We explored the increasingly troubling moral compromises that appeared to accompany that growth, culminating in genuinely disturbing allegations of murder for hire that permanently complicated any simple, comfortable narrative about Ross's underlying character and motivations. We witnessed the empire's dramatic collapse inside an unassuming public library on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and we followed the resulting legal battle that forced an entire courtroom, and by extension the broader public, to grapple directly with profound, unresolved questions about liberty, responsibility, and proportional justice. And finally, We traced the strange, genuinely unpredictable afterlife of this entire saga, from the successor marketplaces that emerged almost immediately following the Silk Road's collapse, to the remarkable, almost unbelievable financial journey of the seized Bitcoin itself, and ultimately to Ross's own unexpected release over a decade after his original arrest, through a presidential pardon that few observers at any point throughout his lengthy imprisonment would have confidently predicted. What then is the larger enduring lesson this entire story leaves us with as we prepare to close this particular chapter of our ongoing series exploring history's great criminal cases and economic catastrophes? Perhaps it is this. Throughout human history, the development of powerful new technology has almost always outpaced the development of the legal, ethical, and regulatory frameworks needed to govern its use responsibly. This was true of the printing press, which enabled both the rapid spread of scientific knowledge and devastating propaganda. It was true of the automobile, which transformed global commerce while simultaneously introducing entirely new categories of accidental death. And it has proven especially dramatically true of the internet age, an era defined by tools like encrypted anonymity networks and decentralized digital currency, technologies capable of protecting genuine human rights activists in oppressive regimes, while simultaneously enabling exactly the kind of massive, borderline untraceable criminal enterprise that Ross Ulbricht successfully built almost entirely alone from a small rented room in Texas. This gap between technological capability and societal readiness shows no meaningful sign of closing anytime soon. If anything, as artificial intelligence, advanced cryptography, and increasingly sophisticated decentralized systems continue rapidly evolving in the years ahead, this fundamental tension seems likely to grow only more pronounced, not less. And so we leave you at the close of this particular case file with a genuinely difficult question, one worth sitting with long after this episode is ended. If human ingenuity can, and eventually will, produce technology capable of creating something approaching a truly perfect, functionally invisible marketplace, one beyond the meaningful reach of any government, any regulator, any traditional system of accountability, what exactly will stop future architects of similarly ambitious systems from making the very same choices Ross Ulbricht ultimately made? And more importantly, what kind of ethical framework, what kind of genuine internal compass would need to exist within any individual holding that kind of extraordinary, unprecedented power to prevent history from repeating this same painful pattern all over again? That is a question this series will continue returning to again and again as we explore future case files throughout this ongoing journey into history's great scandals, criminal empires, staff, and economic catastrophes. Thank you for joining us for this deep 12-chapter journey into the rise and fall and ultimately the unexpected resurrection of Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road, one of the most remarkable, morally complicated stories in the entire history of the digital age. If this case file kept you hooked from beginning to end, do us a genuine favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a future episode in this series. If you're already subscribed, take just a moment to hit like on this video. It makes a real, measurable difference in helping this channel reach more listeners who love stories exactly like this one. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Was justice ultimately served in this case, or did the system get it wrong, either at sentencing or at the moment of that final pardon? And if you know someone who would be completely captivated by this story, go ahead and share this episode with them right now. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next case file.